Hey there, welcome to True Crime Records. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most unsettling cases in American criminal history, a story that takes place far from big cities or crowded streets, in a quiet stretch of New Mexico desert where almost nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. David Parker Ray. To his neighbors, he was a mechanic, a calm man who kept to himself, someone who smiled politely and drove to work each morning like anyone else. Nothing about him suggested danger. Nothing hinted at the hidden world he'd built behind a simple, unremarkable trailer on a dusty property. But the truth beneath that facade was darker than anyone imagined, a world constructed slowly, deliberately, piece by piece, far from watching eyes. Ray lived a double life built on secrecy, control, and manipulation, using charm and quiet confidence as his most effective disguises. For years, the desert held his secrets. For years, silence protected him. And for years, no one realized a predator was living among them, hiding behind an ordinary face in an ordinary town. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. It's always incredible seeing this calm late-night true crime family stretch across time zones. Now settle in. This is True Crime Records, and if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. And follow me into the stillness of New Mexico's Elephant Butte, a place where the desert kept too many secrets for too long. Chapter 1, The Quiet Town and the Man Who Blended In. Elephant Butte, New Mexico was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where the days were quiet, the nights were still, and the desert stretched endlessly in every direction like a vast ocean of sand baked under a relentless sun. People came here for peace, for space, for a chance to breathe without the noise of cities pressing in on them. It was a place where neighbors waved from their porches, where pickup trucks rattled down sun-faded roads, and where the air carried the faint scent of scrub brush and distant lake water. Life here was simple, steady, predictable, and that was exactly why no one suspected that anything unusual was happening just beyond the horizon of ordinary life. Amid this calm small-town rhythm lived a man who seemed to fit in perfectly, David Parker Ray. To the locals, he was quiet, polite in a distant sort of way, someone who fixed engines, tinkered with machines, and kept to himself. He drove an older truck, wore the same sun-bleached work shirts, and moved with the slow, steady purpose of someone who had lived in the desert long enough to understand its silence. Nothing about him stood out, nothing about his life alarmed anyone, and that was the most unsettling part of his story. Ray lived in a modest house near the Elephant Butte Reservoir, far enough from others that the world felt empty at night, just the wind drifting across the sand and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. From the outside, his home looked ordinary, weathered walls, dusty windows, an aging garage filled with tools and equipment. People drove past without giving it a second glance. No one wondered what lay behind the closed doors or why Ray was so private, because in a place like Elephant Butte, privacy wasn't unusual. It was expected. In town, Ray spoke little but listened closely. He had a calm, almost gentle voice, and a way of looking at people that made them feel like he was studying them, rather than simply seeing them. Most brushed it off as a quirk, an odd but harmless trait of a man who spent more time with engines than with people. When he visited the local diner, he sat alone, ate slowly, and nodded politely at anyone who greeted him. If someone asked him about his work, he answered in a way that was vague but believable. A mechanic. A repairman. A man who fixed things. And in a small, quiet town, that was more than enough explanation. Ray's property, tucked behind a few scraggly trees and stretches of dry brush, blended perfectly into the desert. The sun bleached its edges, the dust softened its outline, and the silence wrapped around it like a shroud. The few who had been on the property remembered the clutter of tools, the sound of metal being worked, the faint hum of machinery, nothing out of the ordinary for a man who lived off repairs and odd jobs. Even the trailer on his land, an old cargo-style structure with reinforced walls, didn't seem strange at first glance. People in the desert owned all sorts of makeshift storage spaces. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't suspicious. It was just another object on another stretch of quiet land. And yet, for reasons no one could see, Ray guarded that trailer fiercely. He kept it locked at all times. He kept its keys close. He never let anyone step inside. When neighbors asked what was in it, he gave answers that felt casual but ended conversations quickly. Tools, he'd say. Equipment. Just storage. His tone was always steady. Nothing to question. Nothing to challenge. Ray had learned long ago that silence was the best camouflage. But beyond the surface of this quiet desert existence lay a mind shaped by things most people never imagined. The seeds of secrecy had been planted early in his life, long before Elephant Butte, long before adulthood. Growing up, Ray had experienced a childhood marked by instability, by fractured relationships, by influences that pulled him in directions that blurred boundaries most people never crossed. He was withdrawn, observant, the kind of child who watched others closely but revealed little of himself. Teachers described him as polite and quiet. Family members remembered him as distant and hard to read. Even as a young boy, Ray carried something inside him, something obscured, something he kept hidden from everyone around him. As he grew older, that hidden world deepened. He learned how to blend in, how to mimic normalcy, how to say just enough to avoid suspicion. He developed a fascination with control, not openly, not obviously, but in ways that made sense only to him. He gravitated toward machinery because machines responded predictably. They didn't argue. They didn't resist. They didn't demand anything emotional from him. In a world where people were confusing, machines made sense. And Elephant Butte, with its quiet isolation and sparse population, offered something else he valued: freedom from scrutiny. Out here, no one asked many questions. Out here, a man could shape his world however he wanted as long as he didn't cause trouble. And Ray didn't. Not publicly. Not visibly. Not in ways anyone could see. To friends, and there were a few, Ray seemed calm, almost soft-spoken. He had a dry sense of humor and a way of telling stories that made people lean in. He was intelligent, surprisingly so, with a mechanical mind that could fix nearly anything. People respected that about him. They trusted him with their cars, their tools, their equipment. In return, Ray maintained the persona he had perfected over years: helpful when needed, quiet when not, always keeping just enough distance to prevent anyone from truly knowing who he was. Yet beneath that carefully built exterior, something restless simmered, a private world Ray visited in solitude, a world fueled by fantasies he kept locked away just as tightly as the trailer on his property. The desert made hiding easy. The isolation made secrecy possible. And the quiet rhythm of the town made it nearly impossible for anyone to imagine that someone living among them was constructing a private reality completely separate from the one they saw. In Elephant Butte, Ray found the perfect environment for his double life: a town where people noticed little, questioned less, and assumed that danger was something distant, something that lived in big cities or in horror stories on television. But not here. Not in their quiet corner of the world. And that assumption was exactly what allowed Ray to remain invisible for so long. As the sun set over the desert each night, casting long shadows across the dry earth, Ray often walked the perimeter of his property. He paused sometimes, staring out at the fading light as though searching for something in the distance. Perhaps it was a habit. Perhaps it was a ritual. Perhaps it was simply a man reflecting on the vastness of the landscape around him, a landscape that had helped him remain hidden in plain sight. Neighbors who happened to drive by would wave. Ray would wave back. The moment would pass. No one would think twice. And the desert, quiet and sprawling, would keep its secrets a little longer. What no one realized, what no one even imagined, was that inside that quiet man's life, inside that unremarkable trailer behind that unremarkable house, a different world existed. A world built slowly, deliberately, piece by piece. A world that would remain hidden for years, until one day, it wouldn't. Elephant Butte was peaceful. But peace can hide many things. And in the case of David Parker Ray, it hid more than anyone in that town could have ever prepared for. Chapter 2, The Making of a Double Life. David Parker Ray's early life unfolded like a quiet sketch of instability, the kind that doesn't scream danger at first glance but lingers in the background like a shadow waiting for the right moment to stretch across everything. Born into a family that struggled with discipline, control, and emotional distance, Ray learned early on that the world was not a place where comfort came easily. His father was strict and volatile, the sort of man whose moods could shift without warning, turning the household atmosphere into something unpredictable. His mother, often overwhelmed, enforced rules with a sharpness that felt less like guidance and more like survival. In this environment, Ray found himself retreating inward, learning to hide his emotions rather than express them. He became watchful, observant, the kind of child who seemed to absorb the world rather than participate in it, always noticing but rarely speaking. Teachers described him as quiet and withdrawn, smart but uninterested in forming close connections. Other children sensed something different about him, not in an obvious way, but enough that he remained on the outskirts of playground friendships, a figure always present but never quite belonging. In those early years, Ray discovered that solitude offered something human interaction never did: control. When he was alone, there were no unexpected outbursts, no unclear expectations, no pressures to fit into the puzzles of social life. Isolation felt predictable. Safe. And in that isolation, his imagination became more vivid, more private, more separate from the world around him. As the years passed, adolescence brought its own turbulence. Ray grew taller, stronger, and more mechanically inclined. He spent hours taking apart machines, understanding how pieces fit together, how something broken could be reassembled into something functional. This fascination with mechanics wasn't just a hobby, it became a language he could understand deeply, one that made perfect sense compared to the confusing emotional world of people. Machines were honest. They responded exactly as they were designed to. No surprises. No contradictions. By the time he reached high school, Ray had mastered the art of blending into the background. He attended classes, completed work, and participated just enough to avoid drawing attention, but he didn't form close friendships. He didn't date. He didn't confide in anyone. Instead, he developed a habit of watching, quietly, consistently, even methodically. He analyzed how others interacted, how emotions played out, how people revealed vulnerabilities without realizing it. While other teenagers experimented with identity and social circles, Ray's identity formed around silence, discipline, and a growing sense of detachment. At home, the environment remained strained. Arguments echoed through the rooms, authority clashed with resistance, and emotional wounds deepened beneath the surface. Ray learned that open conflict brought consequences, so he continued refining his internal strategy: stay quiet, remain unnoticed, say little, reveal nothing. This pattern, the withdrawal, the internal world building, the emotional disconnection, laid the groundwork for the man he would become. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, like layers of sand settling into place over time. When Ray reached adulthood, the transition seemed almost seamless. He moved through life with a calm, composed demeanor that made him appear responsible, stable, even trustworthy. He joined the military, where discipline was structured and rules were clear. The environment suited him: predictability, hierarchy, order. He fulfilled his duties with quiet efficiency, following commands without hesitation, blending into the system without drawing attention. Yet even in this environment, Ray remained distant. Fellow service members noted his silence, his habit of staying to himself, his preference for solitary tasks. He never caused trouble, never acted out, never revealed anything that hinted at inner turmoil. But the seeds were still there, the isolation, the fascination with control, the internal world unshared with anyone. When he eventually left the military, Ray returned to New Mexico and slipped back into civilian life with little disruption. He worked various mechanical jobs, developing a reputation as someone who could fix almost anything. His technical skill impressed people. His calm demeanor reassured them. His reliability made him a trusted figure. But none of these traits allowed people to see beneath the surface. To them, he was simply a quiet man who kept to himself, nothing alarming, nothing suspicious. In truth, adulthood only deepened his internal divisions. Ray began creating more space between his outer persona and his inner world. The mask became smoother, more convincing. He learned how to smile politely, how to make conversation when required, how to appear helpful without ever letting others close. The more he refined this mask, the easier it became to hide behind it. Meanwhile, his internal world grew more elaborate, filled with fantasies centered on power, dominance, and control, fantasies shaped by early experiences of feeling powerless, unseen, and emotionally isolated. These fantasies were carefully contained at first, existing only in his mind, locked away from the world. But like all secrets, they became heavier over time, demanding attention, demanding space. Ray responded by creating routines that allowed him to maintain his double life. He structured his days around predictability and his nights around solitude. He told people just enough about himself to satisfy their curiosity without revealing anything personal. And because he caused no trouble, because he didn't display anger or aggression in public, because he seemed calm and ordinary, the world gave him the perfect cover, invisibility. In small-town New Mexico, it was easy to disappear in plain sight. The desert provided space. The quiet provided cover. The sparse population provided anonymity. Neighbors saw him mowing his yard, fixing engines, walking across the sunlit dirt with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. They saw what he wanted them to see, a mechanic, a worker, a quiet man living a quiet life. But they never saw the careful boundaries he maintained, the distance he enforced, the watchfulness behind his calm expression. Ray understood something deeply: when you appear ordinary, people don't look closely. When you cause no trouble, no one asks questions. When you blend in, you become invisible. And invisibility is a powerful tool for anyone living a double life. As years passed, Ray's inner world and outer reality drifted further apart. The mechanics of control that he admired in machines began to influence the way he thought about people. He viewed emotions as unpredictable variables, relationships as complicated mechanisms, and vulnerability as something to be avoided at all costs. Instead of forming genuine bonds, he perfected the art of manipulating perceptions. Calmness became his disguise. Silence became his shield. Predictability became his camouflage. This was not a transformation that happened overnight, it was a gradual evolution, shaped by childhood wounds, emotional withdrawal, and the need for a world he could control entirely. He learned that trust could be mimicked. Kindness could be performed. Normalcy could be constructed like a machine, piece by piece, methodically, convincingly. And because he had built this outer persona so carefully, no one ever questioned the inconsistencies. No one wondered why he never opened up. No one asked why he preferred isolation. In a small desert town, where people believed danger lived somewhere else, Ray's double life remained perfectly hidden. The mask of calmness stayed intact. The machinery of deception ran smoothly. And behind that ordinary image walked a man who felt increasingly separate from the world around him, a man shaped by silence, isolation, and fantasies of control that had taken root long before anyone realized there was something to fear. By the time Ray entered his 40s, the divide between who he appeared to be and who he truly was had grown into a chasm. He had built a life designed entirely around concealment, around secrecy, around the illusion of normalcy. And the world believed it. The desert believed it. Even the people closest to him believed it. No one suspected that beneath the surface of this polite, quiet mechanic lived a mind shaped by decades of emotional solitude and twisted fantasies, a mind preparing for something the town of Elephant Butte was not remotely ready to face. Chapter 3: The Blueprint of Control. By the time David Parker Ray entered the later stretch of adulthood, his life had settled into a pattern that looked ordinary from the outside but operated with a precision that only he fully understood. The quiet desert town around him had no idea that beneath his calm exterior, a different blueprint was forming, a psychological map built from decades of isolation, detachment, and fantasies that had gradually taken on more structure, more direction, and more purpose. It didn't happen suddenly, it wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation. It unfolded slowly, subtly, like a shadow stretching across the sand as the sun sets. Ray moved through life with the same steady, controlled demeanor he always had, but something inside him was shifting. The fantasies he once kept entirely to himself were no longer enough. They had grown too large, too detailed, too consuming to remain trapped within the confines of imagination. His mind had constructed an inner world where he commanded every detail, where control was absolute, where unpredictability didn't exist. And over time, he began searching for ways to bring that inner world into reality without letting the outer world notice a single thing. The desert, with its quiet distances and natural solitude, made this easier. Ray understood that his environment protected him. The isolation offered privacy. The lack of scrutiny created opportunities. And the deep-rooted culture of minding one's own business allowed him to experiment with the boundaries between thought and action. The first steps he took were small. Almost invisible. He reorganized his workspace with a kind of meticulous care that bordered on obsession. Tools were arranged not just by type but by purpose. Neighboring equipment was sorted into categories only he understood. He built areas of his property designed for different tasks, some practical, some secret, some existing only because they served the quiet fantasies brewing inside him. People who saw these changes dismissed them as the quirks of a dedicated mechanic. After all, what harm was there in a man who liked order? Who liked precision? Who liked things to be exactly where he wanted them? In a small town, habits like that weren't just normal, they were expected. But Ray's intention went far beyond organization. He wasn't just arranging tools, he was arranging control. The more he shaped his environment, the more powerful he felt. And the more powerful he felt, the more he craved an environment where he alone dictated every variable. The desert became his workshop. His sanctuary. His shield. And slowly, quietly, he began constructing a private world that no one else would ever fully understand. He started making regular trips to salvage yards, auctions, and hardware stores, sometimes buying items that made sense, sometimes buying things that didn't seem to fit any logical purpose. Heavy chains. Locks. Reinforced panels. Mechanical parts that could be altered or repurposed. People assumed he was working on a side project, maybe restoring old equipment, maybe planning an expansion of his workshop. Ray never corrected them. He never revealed more than he needed to. A simple nod, a quiet smile, and the conversation ended. He answered every question with calm normalcy, using the vagueness he had mastered over the years to keep people from probing deeper. At the same time, Ray began refining how he interacted with the community. His mask grew smoother, more polished. He appeared helpful, dependable, professional. He offered assistance when people's cars broke down. He gave advice about engines or equipment. He chatted politely at the diner when approached, though never for long. Every interaction served a purpose. Every gesture maintained the illusion. People began trusting him more without realizing they were doing it. That trust became a tool, just like the equipment in his workshop. And Ray appreciated tools, especially the ones that helped him shape perception. His private world continued to grow. Late at night, when the desert cooled and the wind blew across the sand in soft, distant murmurs, Ray worked in silence. He focused with the intensity of a man constructing something deeply important. Piece by piece, he transformed part of his property into a space not meant for visitors or casual use, but for the fantasies he had nurtured for decades. He reinforced walls, added locks, adjusted lighting, experimented with layouts. He worked with patience, like a craftsman building a masterpiece. And the more he built, the more detached he became from the version of himself the world believed in. The desert nights felt endless, and in that endlessness, his hidden world grew stronger. During the day, he blended in as usual. Neighbors saw him working on cars, tinkering in his yard, walking across the property with a slow, thoughtful pace. Kids rode their bikes nearby without a hint of fear. Adults greeted him politely and continued with their day. He was invisible because he chose to be. Because he understood exactly how to move through a world that never thought to question him. The key to Ray's evolving double life wasn't aggression or recklessness, it was patience. He took his time. He waited for opportunities. He refined his environment. He perfected his mask. He allowed the world to see only what he wanted them to see. And because he had never caused trouble, because he had always lived quietly, because he appeared harmless, no one ever looked closely enough to see the truth underneath. What made Ray especially dangerous was not just his ability to hide, it was his ability to appear trustworthy. He seemed stable, calm, capable. He lived a predictable routine. He treated people with polite distance. He never drew attention. People trusted the illusion because it was easier than imagining anything else. And with each day that went by, Ray grew more confident in his ability to maintain that illusion. In his mind, his life was split cleanly in two. The outer life, the mechanic, the neighbor, the polite man who nodded at strangers. And the inner life, the architect of a world built on control, secrecy, and the desire to create a space where he alone dictated the rules. That division became sharper, deeper, more defined with every project he completed and every tool he acquired. By the late 1980s, Ray's hidden world was no longer just a collection of fantasies or isolated ideas. It had become a structured system, methodical, organized, deliberate. And the more structured it became, the more Ray withdrew emotionally from the ordinary parts of his life. Relationships became shallow and functional. Conversations became rehearsed. Friendships, already distant, faded further. He didn't need emotional connections. He needed control. He needed privacy. And above all, he needed an environment where his inner world could exist without interference. Throughout this time, Ray maintained the appearance of someone perfectly normal. He kept up his home. He went to work. He interacted politely with locals. He visited the lake. He lived the life of a man who blended seamlessly into the desert landscape. But every night, when the world quieted, his true focus returned to the private life unfolding behind closed doors. His preparations were meticulous, sometimes spanning weeks or months. He documented ideas, sketched layouts, identified weaknesses in his environment, and adjusted accordingly. Each modification he made served a purpose. Each piece of his hidden space was designed with intention. Nothing was random. Nothing was impulsive. Every detail reflected the mind of someone who valued structure above all else. And as that structure grew, so did his confidence. Ray believed he had created a system that made him untouchable, a life divided so perfectly that no one would ever connect his public persona with the private world he had built. He believed the desert would protect him. He believed the town's trust would shield him. He believed his mask was unbreakable. And for a long time, he was right. The people of Elephant Butte continued living their quiet lives, unaware that a world of secrecy existed just beyond their view. Ray continued moving through the town with the same calm demeanor, the same polite nods, the same distant presence. And the desert continued to hold its silence. But as Ray refined his hidden world, he didn't realize that he was also creating the very clues that would one day unravel everything he'd built. Because no matter how carefully a double life is constructed, no matter how deeply someone hides behind a mask, the truth has a way of waiting, quietly, patiently, for the moment it can rise to the surface. And for David Parker Ray, that moment was coming, even if the desert's stillness made it feel impossibly distant. Chapter 4: The Circle He Built in the Dark. As David Parker Ray drifted deeper into his hidden world, one of the most quietly disturbing aspects of his evolution was how effortlessly he managed to pull other people into his orbit, people who, in different circumstances, might never have crossed paths with someone like him but who became entangled in his life through a mixture of charm, manipulation, and the subtle gravitational pull of secrecy. Ray understood people far better than he ever let on. He knew which personalities could be influenced, which insecurities could be pressed, and which individuals were desperate for connection, validation, or a sense of belonging, needs he offered to fulfill just enough to keep them close without ever letting them see who he truly was. It started slowly, almost innocently, with casual acquaintances who frequented the same bars, diners, or workplaces. Ray didn't choose friends the way most people did, he selected them. He observed carefully before approaching, testing boundaries with small conversations, learning what people feared, what they wanted, what they lacked. And when he sensed someone was vulnerable or directionless, he stepped in with the quiet confidence of a man who seemed steady, calm, and reliable. People like that gravitated toward him because he offered something they didn't find easily elsewhere, a sense of control, structure, and focus. He spoke in a low, reassuring voice. He explained things in ways that made others feel understood. He provided attention without judgment. On the surface, it felt like mentorship or friendship. Beneath the surface, it was something far more calculated. Ray built these connections the same way he built everything else in his life, slowly, deliberately, with a focus on long-term purpose rather than momentary gain. He never rushed, he nurtured dependency quietly, patiently, until the people around him began trusting him more than they trusted their own judgment. One by one, individuals drifted into his inner circle, not realizing they were stepping into a world designed entirely around Ray's control. Among those drawn closest to him were people who struggled with direction or stability, individuals looking for guidance, attention, or a sense of significance. Ray offered all of that, wrapped in a calm, fatherly demeanor that made it easy to overlook the subtle ways he manipulated conversations, decisions, and emotions. He didn't dominate aggressively, he guided gently. He didn't demand loyalty, he nurtured it. And because he appeared so patient, so consistent, so quietly authoritative, people followed him without fully understanding why. Over time, Ray developed relationships that extended beyond casual interactions, connections built on whispered conversations, shared secrets, and the kind of quiet loyalty that can form when someone believes they've finally found a person who sees them, understands them, and makes them feel valued. He became a protector to some, a confidant to others, a mentor to those who felt lost. To each person, he showed a different side of himself, carefully calibrated to what they needed to see in order to stay close. But behind every gesture, every smile, every moment of supposed empathy, Ray was studying the people around him with the same analytical precision he applied to machines and tools. He assessed reliability, emotional stability, susceptibility to influence. He noted who was loyal by nature and who needed to be guided into loyalty. He tested limits gradually, watching how people reacted to small acts of secrecy or moral ambiguity. He learned who could keep quiet, who could rationalize things, who could be persuaded to ignore the strange or unsettling parts of his personality. And slowly, his circle began to solidify. Some of these individuals came from difficult backgrounds. Some struggled with addiction, loneliness, or a lack of direction. Some were simply hungry for attention. Whatever their vulnerabilities were, Ray learned how to use them, not with cruelty, but with cold, deliberate intent. He gave people what they needed so he could take what he wanted later. Because of this, those closest to him never saw him as dangerous. They saw him as a caretaker, a provider, someone who offered stability in a world where they'd never had it. His calm demeanor and steady voice created an atmosphere of safety around him, even though he was the last person they should have trusted. As Ray's circle grew closer, he began sharing pieces of his private world in ways that seemed thrilling or mysterious to those who didn't fully understand what they were stepping into. He allowed glimpses of his hidden spaces, not the disturbing truth of them, but the parts that looked like intense hobbyist workshops or survivalist setups. He explained away unusual equipment with practiced ease, describing projects that sounded just believable enough to quiet curiosity. And because these individuals trusted him, because they believed in the version of him he presented, they accepted his explanations without digging deeper. Sometimes, Ray introduced a more controlled, filtered version of his private fantasies into conversations, not explicitly, not disturbingly, but in ways that tested how far others could be led into morally ambiguous territory without pulling away. He framed these discussions academically or hypothetically, presenting them as intellectual curiosities, psychological puzzles, or conversations about human nature and power dynamics. Those who remained unbothered or intrigued by such topics became more deeply tied to him. Those who recoiled never knew how close they had come to seeing his real mask slip. The people who stayed became extensions of Ray's double life, buffers, distractions, shields. They vouched for his character in the community. They spent time with him publicly, helping reinforce the illusion of normalcy. They protected him unintentionally by believing the best in him. Ray understood the value of that protection. He understood that if he could create a small network of people who trusted him implicitly, the rest of the world would eventually treat him the same way. And for years, that's exactly what happened. His circle not only reinforced his facade but also helped normalize his increasingly unusual behavior. When someone raised a small concern, another person would dismiss it. That's just how he is. He's harmless. He's just private. He's a mechanic, he needs that stuff. Over time, Ray's closest connections became blind spots in the community. People trusted him because others trusted him. People overlooked red flags because his circle overlooked them. Ray had effectively created a social shield, built on carefully engineered loyalty and the quiet comfort of familiarity. But what made Ray's inner circle especially dangerous was that some members became willing participants in parts of his secret world, not always fully understanding the implications, not always recognizing the line between fantasy and his darker intentions. His influence wasn't aggressive, it was insidious. He offered people purpose, belonging, structure, things they lacked elsewhere. He offered them roles in his private world that made them feel important, valuable, essential. And once they accepted those roles, it became harder to walk away. Harder to question him. Harder to see him clearly. In the quiet desert town of Truth or Consequences and Elephant Butte, people simply believed Ray was a man who kept unusual company, who lived a private life, who enjoyed hobbies that were a little strange but ultimately harmless. They didn't see the manipulation, the testing, the gradual erosion of boundaries. They didn't see the way he molded people into extensions of his will. They didn't see the quiet power he held over those he brought close. To the outside world, Ray remained the same calm, polite man he had always been, but now he was surrounded by a protective layer of relationships he had engineered with meticulous care. His outer life appeared stable. His inner world grew stronger. And the line between them blurred more with each passing year. What Ray didn't realize was that this circle he built, these people he manipulated into loyalty, would eventually become part of the cracks in his facade. Because secrecy doesn't last forever. Because loyalty under pressure can fracture. Because even the strongest mask begins to slip when too many people are close enough to touch it. For now, though, Ray's world held firm. His circle revolved around him like planets orbiting a sun, unaware that the light they felt was the glow of something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. And the desert, always silent, kept watch over it all as Ray continued perfecting the life he believed he could control forever. Chapter 5: The Man No One Questioned. As the years drifted onward, the most chilling part of David Parker Ray's life was not the secrecy itself, but how effortlessly he maintained the illusion of normalcy. In a small desert town where people preferred the comfort of routine over the trouble of suspicion, Ray became the kind of man no one ever thought to question, the quiet neighbor who waved from his yard, the man who fixed engines with impressive skill, the familiar face who appeared in local shops and diners just often enough to seem social, but not enough to draw attention. It was a delicate balance, one he perfected over time, and every piece of his public life was carefully shaped to protect the private world he'd built behind closed doors. When people in Elephant Butte spoke about Ray, they described him in terms that were mundane, even comforting. "He's a little odd," some said, but in the same tone they used for anyone who preferred solitude over small talk. Others called him dependable, someone who showed up to work on time, completed tasks without complaint, and avoided trouble. He was the kind of man who blended into the rhythm of the town so smoothly that he became part of the background, as unremarkable as the dusty roads and quiet sunsets. And because his behavior never betrayed anything extreme or alarming, the community accepted him exactly as he appeared, never imagining how carefully he curated every gesture, every word, every moment of his life outside his hidden world. One of Ray's greatest strengths was his predictability, that he created routines that made him seem steady and reliable, patterns that became so consistent people stopped noticing them. He left home at the same time most mornings. He drove the same vehicles. He visited the same stores. He bought supplies that were common for mechanics and hobbyists, items that never raised suspicion because people had seen him working with machines for years. When he needed something unusual, he purchased it slowly over time, from different places, never enough at once to draw attention. His errands often appeared harmless, even if they served a much darker purpose. The rhythm of familiarity lulled people into believing they knew him. And once they believed that, they stopped seeing him clearly. Ray's calm demeanor helped reinforce that illusion. He rarely raised his voice, rarely appeared angry, rarely displayed anything other than a steady, controlled presence. Even when he disagreed with someone, he did it in a soft, quiet tone that made conflict seem impossible. That gentleness disarmed people, made them trust him more, made them believe that whatever strange hobbies or private habits he had were harmless quirks rather than warning signs. It was a subtle, unspoken manipulation that allowed Ray to keep the world at a comfortable distance. At the same time, his property became a fortress of privacy. He knew exactly how to keep people out without appearing unfriendly. He always had an excuse ready if someone asked about renovations or the locked trailer or the cluttered workshop. "Just tools," he'd say. "Just projects. Just storage." His tone never wavered, never hinted at pressure. People accepted his answers because his confidence left no room for doubt. And because he never invited anyone inside his private spaces, those spaces became invisible to everyone but him. The desert made that privacy easy: isolated roads, wide stretches of land, the kind of silence that swallowed activity whole once the sun dipped low. Many nights, Ray worked late into the darkness, moving with the slow, precise actions of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. He adjusted mechanisms, reinforced walls, reorganized compartments, each modification adding another layer to the hidden life he'd spent decades building. The more he built, the more convinced he became that no one would ever discover the truth. After all, no one had questioned him yet. No one had noticed anything strange. No one had ever connected the subtle inconsistencies in his behavior because those inconsistencies were buried beneath years of trust, complacency, and routine. Ray understood that in small towns, danger was assumed to come from outsiders, not familiar faces. He used that belief like a shield. People expected threats to be loud, chaotic, aggressive, nothing like the polite man who kept to himself. Most didn't understand that the most dangerous individuals often appeared the least threatening. Ray took advantage of that gap in understanding, shaping his appearance and behavior to fall perfectly into the category of harmless local. Meanwhile, his connections, carefully chosen individuals who lingered in the space between loyalty and dependency, helped maintain his disguise. Some defended him instinctively, believing he was misunderstood or unfairly judged by those who found him unusual. Some depended on his guidance or companionship and were unwilling to question the parts of his life that didn't make sense. And some simply didn't notice anything strange because they never looked closely enough to see the unease beneath the surface. These people became another layer of his protection, even without realizing it. Their trust in him persuaded others to trust him too. Their presence around him made him seem safe. Their acceptance of his behavior made questioning him feel unnecessary. And because they never saw his true nature, they became the perfect advocates for the version of himself he wanted the world to believe. Over time, Ray's ability to compartmentalize became almost superhuman. He could fix an engine during the day and return to his secret world at night as if switching between two entirely separate lives. His emotions remained controlled. His expressions remained steady. His voice remained soft. He spoke to neighbors with the same tone he used when purchasing tools for his hidden projects. It was this level of emotional discipline that made his double life so terrifying. He could shift between roles without hesitation, without visible conflict, without slipping. Most people, even those with secrets, showed cracks eventually. Ray didn't. That made him invisible in a way that went far beyond simple shyness or introversion. He had learned how to match the expectations of every person he interacted with. When talking to mechanics, he spoke like a mechanic. When speaking to neighbors, he sounded like a neighbor. When chatting with someone from out of town, he became a calm, friendly local eager to offer directions or casual conversation. Each version of himself was crafted to feel authentic, and each one helped hide the truth underneath. His empathy was rehearsed. His politeness was practiced. His stability was engineered. And in a town where people valued simplicity over suspicion, his performance worked flawlessly. As years passed, Ray's confidence grew. He began believing his mask was unbreakable, that the world around him would never think to question him. He believed he had mastered the art of invisibility. And it was that belief, that quiet certainty, that allowed him to continue expanding the hidden world he had built, piece by piece, until it no longer felt like a fantasy but a reality he controlled entirely. But in maintaining that illusion, Ray also made a critical miscalculation. He underestimated the fragility of trust. He didn't realize that even the strongest masks become vulnerable when too many people see different parts of them. He didn't realize that even the desert can't bury every secret. His life looked perfect on the surface, controlled, predictable, untouched by suspicion. Beneath that surface, however, hairline cracks had begun forming. They were small, invisible at first, but they existed. Cracks caused by inconsistencies he hadn't noticed, by people who were starting to see glimpses of things that didn't quite add up, by moments where his mask slipped just enough to reveal something colder underneath. Ray didn't notice those cracks forming. Or maybe he noticed but believed he could close them before they widened. Either way, The world he believed was unbreakable had already shifted ever so slightly out of his control. It would take time for those cracks to grow, for the illusion to falter, for the desert to lose its grip on secrecy. But the process had already begun. And though Ray couldn't see it yet, the life he had built was slowly, quietly heading toward its unraveling, one small fracture at a time. Chapter 5: The Man No One Questioned. Elephant Butte was a place where people trusted routine, where daily life unfolded at the same slow pace under the desert sun, and where neighbors believed they knew the people living beside them simply because they had seen the same faces for years. It was this environment, calm, predictable, unhurried, that allowed David Parker Ray to hide so effectively in plain sight. He shaped his public persona with precision, presenting himself as a quiet, hardworking mechanic who minded his own business and caused no trouble. People noticed his calm voice, his steady presence, and the way he never raised concern or seemed out of step with the community. And because he fit neatly into their expectations, they never looked closely enough to see the shadows hiding behind the ordinary details of his life. Ray cultivated trust the way other people tended gardens, slowly, carefully, with a kind of patience that made his presence feel natural. When neighbors waved, he waved back. When someone stopped to ask about engine trouble, he offered advice without hesitation. He spoke politely at the diner, nodded respectfully at the gas station, and carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing harmless. He didn't overshare. He didn't draw attention. He didn't do anything that invited suspicion. And in a small town where simplicity was an article of faith, people accepted him exactly as he appeared. His routines reinforced this illusion. Ray left home at predictable times, returned at predictable times, bought groceries in predictable patterns. He frequented the same stores, visited the same roadside shops, filled up at the same gas station. Even his trips to hardware stores or salvage yards blended seamlessly into the identity he cultivated: a mechanic, a handyman, a man constantly repairing, building, or tinkering with equipment. If he purchased something unusual, he made sure it was spaced out. Over time, small enough to seem insignificant. A few locks here. A few heavy-duty parts there. Nothing that would make anyone question him. Over years, he constructed a rhythm for himself so stable that the community stopped noticing the details. Routine is powerful like that, it can make even the suspicious feel normal if repeated long enough. Ray understood this instinctively. His property was an extension of that predictability. He kept his yard tidy enough to avoid raising eyebrows but not so perfect as to seem obsessive. He placed tools where people expected to see them, left equipment half disassembled as if working on a long-term project, and always had a plausible excuse ready if someone asked about anything out of place. Just working on something. Just storing parts. Just repairing some old equipment. His explanations were simple, vague, and delivered with such calm confidence that no one questioned them. And because he never let anyone inside his locked spaces, people never saw anything that contradicted his words. The desert silence became his ally. At night, when the town quieted and winds drifted across the sand, Ray worked with the patience of a man constructing something deeply personal. He reinforced structures, organized equipment, adjusted mechanisms, all in the privacy of a land where sound rarely traveled far. The stillness of the desert swallowed noise and movement, offering him a shield no crowded city could provide. And as he built, he became increasingly convinced that no one would ever uncover his hidden world. But the most unsettling part of Ray's double life was how thoroughly the community embraced his mask. People described him as reliable, soft-spoken, responsible. Odd, but harmless, some would say, the same phrase small towns have used for decades to dismiss the quirks of neighbors they think they understand. When Ray was seen with individuals of questionable character, people chalked it up to kindness or patience. When he kept unusual hours, they assumed he was working on late-night projects. When he appeared secretive, they attributed it to his quiet personality. In truth, their assumptions formed a protective shield around him, one he relied on heavily. And his inner circle reinforced that shield without realizing it. People who trusted him spoke highly of him. People who depended on him defended him. People who admired him vouched for him. Loyalty created camouflage. Familiarity created blindness. And Ray stood quietly in the middle of it all, aware that every gesture of trust from others made it easier for him to continue building the hidden life he believed would remain undiscovered forever. As Ray's confidence grew, so did the complexity of his secret world. He began investing more time into refining the hidden structure behind his home, adjusting layouts, strengthening walls, organizing tools with obsessive care. He treated the space like an engineer perfecting a delicate machine, making modifications that were invisible to outsiders but deeply meaningful to him. Each change added another layer to the life he kept concealed, another step in the transformation of a simple mechanic's workshop into something far more private. And with every modification, Ray became more certain that no one would ever notice. The townspeople had already accepted his quirks as harmless. His neighbors had grown accustomed to his silence. The individuals who relied on him defended him without hesitation. The routines he established made him appear predictable. It all combined to create the perfect shield, one strong enough, he believed, to last a lifetime. Yet, without realizing it, Ray had begun leaving faint cracks in the foundation of his disguise. They were small at first, moments where his explanations didn't fully match his behavior, moments where he reacted too quickly to questions, moments where people noticed something slightly off but dismissed it before the thought had time to grow. A neighbor saw him hauling equipment late one night and briefly wondered why he was working so late. A coworker noticed he often locked certain drawers or cabinets he never allowed anyone near. A friend felt uneasy about Ray's calmness during conversations that drifted into darker topics. These were tiny details. Almost insignificant. But cracks rarely begin large, they start as hairline fractures beneath the surface, invisible unless someone is looking closely. And in Ray's case, no one was looking. Not yet. The desert still offered cover. The community still trusted him. But the more time Ray spent maintaining two lives, the more energy it required to keep the edges from fraying. And in moments when he grew tired or his focus slipped, small inconsistencies began to show. His voice sharpened unexpectedly when someone approached a restricted area. He became overly attentive to who visited his property and when. He reacted too quickly when someone made a joke about his privacy. These moments passed quickly, but they revealed a truth Ray didn't want to acknowledge. Maintaining a double life was a delicate balancing act, and even the smallest shift could send everything tilting. Still, Ray believed he could handle it. His confidence remained unshaken. He trusted the quiet nature of the town. He trusted the loyalty of those in his inner circle. He trusted the invisibility he had crafted so carefully. But he did not realize that his increasing certainty was the very thing that would eventually lead to his downfall. Because confidence invites risk. Risk invites mistakes. And mistakes, no matter how small, invite attention. In the stillness of Elephant Butte, those cracks remained invisible for now. The world around Ray continued drifting in its slow, sleepy rhythm. But beneath that calm desert surface, the first subtle shifts had begun. The mask he believed was unbreakable was not breaking yet, but it had started to tremble. Chapter 6: The Inner Circle, Trust, Influence, and Control. For years, David Parker Ray crafted a life so carefully insulated by routine and silence that it became almost impossible for anyone in Elephant Butte to imagine him as anything other than the quiet mechanic they saw around town. But as time passed, Ray realized that total isolation wasn't enough to sustain the private world he was building. He needed people around him, not emotionally, but strategically. He needed loyalty, usefulness, and silence. And so, very slowly, he began shaping his own version of an inner circle. It didn't look like a traditional group of confidants, nor did he gather people in a way that drew attention. Instead, Ray relied on individuals who were vulnerable, impressionable, or dependent on him in some way. His influence wasn't loud, it wasn't forceful. It was subtle, patient, and deliberately layered. Ray had long understood how trust worked in small, isolated communities. People tended to believe the version of someone they saw every day. The friendly one. The quiet one. The helpful one. And he used that understanding to position himself as someone who could be relied upon. When people needed favors, he delivered. When someone's car broke down, he offered to repair it. When neighbors struggled with something around the house, he assisted without complaint. It built a reputation not only of reliability but of generosity, the kind that disarmed suspicion. To those within his orbit, Ray's calm demeanor suggested stability. His willingness to listen made him seem understanding. His soft-spoken voice gave the impression of patience. And his careful control of the pace and direction of conversations made people feel like they were being heard, even when he was carefully steering them where he needed them to go. Over time, this dynamic created a subtle but powerful dependency. People began to trust Ray instinctively because he seemed harmless, because he never demanded anything in return, and because his quiet nature made their own secrets feel safe around him. But beneath that calm exterior, Ray assessed every relationship through a different lens, not of connection but of utility. Some individuals provided him with reassurance through loyalty. Others offered him access to information. A few served as buffers, willing to vouch for his character whenever small doubts surfaced in the community. And some, due to personal struggles or instability, became entangled in his world without understanding the depth of the darkness hidden behind his soft tone and patient expression. Ray never announced his expectations. He never asked for devotion directly. Instead, he let people drift into the roles he needed them to fill. His influence was built on subtle reinforcement, moments where he expressed just enough approval to keep someone close, and moments where he withdrew just enough warmth to remind them that his attention could disappear if they weren't careful. He understood human behavior with unsettling clarity. He knew how to build trust. He knew how to cultivate dependency. And he knew how to keep people close without revealing any part of his true intentions. This quiet manipulation created a protective wall around him. When someone mentioned that he kept to himself too much, one of his confidants brushed it off as just his personality. When a neighbor questioned the locked areas of his property, someone else insisted Ray was just private. When rumors surfaced about strange visitors or odd hours, they were quickly dismissed by people who had come to rely on him in subtle, meaningful ways. These small defenses, spoken casually over phone calls or cups of coffee or passing conversations in town, formed a net of protection around Ray, a net he strengthened through every calculated act of kindness. But beneath that surface, Ray observed everyone around him with calculated precision. He noticed when someone seemed more loyal than others. He noticed who asked questions and who accepted his explanations without hesitation. He noticed who was overly trusting, who was desperate for approval, who needed guidance, and who simply needed to feel included. And he positioned himself accordingly. The desert community, already isolated and slow-moving, couldn't see the structure he was building. They saw friendships, routines, and familiar connections. But Ray saw leverage. He saw opportunity. He saw people who filled the spaces that reinforced his double life. And the more he learned about those around him, the more confident he became that no one, not even those closest to him, truly understood what he was capable of. His calm voice, patient eyes, and quiet routines remained the perfect camouflage. And his inner circle, without realizing it, became the final layer of protection shielding the hidden world he believed would remain undisturbed forever. As Ray's network of trusted individuals grew, so did the complexity of the psychological dynamics he maintained between them. He never allowed anyone to get too close, never revealed more than a carefully calculated surface layer of his personality, and ensured that each person saw him in a slightly different way. One viewed him as a mentor. Another saw him as a steadying presence. A third believed he was simply a quiet man who needed company. In reality, each perception was a piece of a larger puzzle, one Ray constructed intentionally through years of subtle adjustment. His ability to mirror the emotional tone of whoever he was speaking with made him seem relatable, even empathetic. When someone shared a fear or frustration, Ray's responses were measured and reassuring. When someone expressed anger, he remained calm, giving the impression of emotional steadiness. When someone needed validation, he offered it just seldom enough that his approval felt earned. This created bonds that felt genuine to those around him but were, in truth, another level of his camouflage. And because people trusted him, they overlooked moments of unease, times when his expression went flat during emotional conversations, or when he asked oddly specific questions, or when he seemed unusually protective of his privacy. Trust, once established, acts like a filter. It reshapes what people notice and what they ignore. Ray knew this. He relied on it. With each passing year, the web of loyalty surrounding him grew stronger. Individuals who saw him as a stabilizing force defended him instinctively when rumors arose. Those who depended on his help vouched for his character. Those who admired his calmness dismissed any odd behavior as harmless quirks. Ray understood precisely how fragile human perception could be. He recognized that most people believed what they wanted to believe, especially in a community where familiarity created comfort. And he built his life around that truth. But even as he strengthened his outer relationships, Ray maintained absolute separation between his public persona and the private world he kept locked behind closed doors. He developed a near-military discipline in compartmentalizing every part of his life. Questions that breached the edges of his private world were met with answers that were vague but delivered with such confidence that no one pressed further. Curiosity was deflected with humor. Suspicion was softened with kindness. And because people trusted their own impressions of him, they dismissed the small inconsistencies in his behavior before doubt had time to take root. But within Ray, the subtle cracks that had begun forming earlier grew wider. The more complex his web became, the more difficult it became to maintain the illusion seamlessly. Moments of irritation surfaced more often when someone unknowingly stepped close to his boundaries. His tone sometimes shifted too quickly when asked about the wrong subject. His gaze occasionally lingered too long on someone who questioned him. These shifts were brief, but they were there, tiny flashes of the truth beneath the surface. And although most people overlooked them, a few individuals quietly noted that something about Ray felt unpredictable. Yet even those faint instincts dissolved under the weight of his cultivated reputation. People didn't want to believe that the polite mechanic could be anything other than what he appeared. He had built his mask too well. He had reinforced it too effectively. The web of influence, once designed to keep suspicion at bay, had now become its own ecosystem, one where everyone around Ray played a role without realizing they were part of something orchestrated. He stood at the center of it, calm, patient, confident. And with every year that passed, he felt more certain that he was uncatchable. But certainty is dangerous. Confidence can cloud judgment. And the more Ray relied on the structure he had built, the less he noticed the subtle ways it was beginning to shift around him. For now, though, in the quiet desert heat of New Mexico, David Parker Ray remained invisible, protected by a community that believed they knew him, surrounded by people who had no idea they were being used, and hidden behind a mask he believed would never crack. Chapter 7: The Desert Builds a Monster. The desert around Elephant Butte has a strange way of shaping the people who live within it. The wide, empty spaces, the endless silence, the long stretches of land where even sound seems to disappear, all of it creates a kind of isolation that feels peaceful on the surface, but can become something else entirely when the wrong mind grows inside it. For David Parker Ray, that isolation worked like fuel. It deepened the shadows he carried, nurtured his fantasies, and offered him a world where nothing disrupted the darkest parts of his imagination. Ray understood the desert. He respected its quiet power. He admired how it concealed everything beneath its stillness, secrets, habits, intentions. And as time passed, he began to mold his own mind around that same silence, becoming someone who could walk through the world unnoticed, undisturbed, and unchallenged. It wasn't a sudden shift. It wasn't an explosion of behavior. Ray's transformation unfolded slowly, like the way temperature drops when the sun slips behind the mountains. Barely noticeable at first. Almost gentle. But inevitable. The early stages of Ray's internal unraveling were quiet enough that no one around him sensed the change. While neighbors tended gardens and families watched their children play in the evening heat, Ray spent more and more time alone, wandering through the isolated stretches of land behind his property. The desert offered him a space with no witnesses, no interruptions, no boundaries. He walked with his hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, moving at a pace that mirrored the quiet rhythm of the land itself. And in that stillness, thoughts he kept buried during the day began to surface. He revisited moments from his childhood, moments of humiliation, moments of anger, moments where he felt powerless. Even decades later, they returned with startling clarity, sharpening emotions he had never learned to process. Instead of fading, those memories hardened. They became the foundation of fantasies that grew more elaborate as he aged. Fantasies built not on impulse but on structure, planned, rehearsed, perfected in silence. Ray's mind evolved with alarming precision. The fantasies offered him control, something he had never experienced as a child. In them, he decided outcomes. He dictated the rules. He shaped the world exactly how he wanted it. And the desert, vast and empty, allowed those fantasies to expand unchecked. No one saw the shift in his eyes when he returned from those solitary walks. No one noticed how his voice grew calmer over time, almost unnervingly steady, as if he were constantly rehearsing a role. No one questioned why he seemed more comfortable alone than around people. To the community, Ray was simply a quiet man who preferred solitude. But inside, something much more dangerous was forming, a man who was no longer content with imagination alone, a man whose inner world was beginning to compete with the outer one. By the late 1980s, Ray's personality had split into two distinct halves. The first was the mask, the polite neighbor, the steady mechanic, the man who nodded respectfully at the grocery store. This version of Ray functioned perfectly in everyday life, barely raising a ripple in the calm routine of Elephant Butte. The second half, the hidden half, grew stronger with each passing year. This was the architect of fantasies, the collector of ideas, the builder of control. He fed this side with books, notes, sketches, and hours of planning. Every detail he imagined, he recorded. He refined concepts that no one else knew existed. His private journals filled with diagrams, observations, and reflections that painted a portrait of a mind descending into a meticulously organized darkness. And as that internal world expanded, Ray became convinced that he was smarter than everyone around him, invisible because he deserved to be. The desert reinforced that belief. It protected him. It reassured him. It whispered to him that nothing hidden would ever be found. Ray began spending entire days alone in the back areas of his property, quietly modifying structures, adding new locks, reinforcing walls, adjusting designs. He moved through those tasks with the calm focus of a craftsman rather than the agitation of someone concealing something deeply disturbing. Every detail mattered. Every angle had purpose. And every decision served a fantasy that had never been spoken aloud to another person. The dangerous part wasn't only what he was building, but how peacefully he built it. There was no rush. No panic. No fear of discovery. Just patience, the kind of patience that comes from someone who believes wholeheartedly that the world will never catch up to him. And with every passing month, Ray felt more certain he had perfected the ability to move between his two lives without detection. But the truth was far more fragile. The boundary between his mask and his shadow was thinning, slowly but unmistakably. And although the desert had given him space to grow his hidden world, it had also made him overconfident. Overconfidence invites mistakes. And mistakes, even small ones, eventually invite attention. By the early 1990s, the two versions of Ray, the quiet mechanic and the hidden architect, no longer existed in balance. The private world had grown too large, too detailed, too consuming. The mask he showed the community still held, but it was beginning to require more effort, more energy, and more planning than before. Ray knew it, but he pushed past the warning signs, believing he had built his life too carefully for anything to collapse. He still greeted neighbors politely. He still lent tools without hesitation. He still offered favors to people who trusted him. But underneath those gestures, something had shifted. His eyes lingered too long on people who asked questions. His posture stiffened when someone walked near restricted areas of his property. He watched conversations more closely, analyzing tones and glances with the precision of someone terrified that the wrong person might stumble across the wrong detail. Yet even that paranoia was quiet, contained behind his usual soft voice and measured expressions. To the community, Ray looked the same as always, maybe a bit tired, maybe more private, but nothing alarming. The illusion held because people wanted it to hold. They weren't looking for a monster. They weren't looking for secrets. They assumed life was simple because small towns are built on the belief that they understand their own. But Ray's private world had reached a point where it no longer needed imagination alone. It needed action. The fantasies he had rehearsed for years began shaping his real-world behavior in subtle ways. He reorganized his workspace not just for function but for control. He planned conversations before they happened, rehearsing phrases, practicing tones, perfecting lies. He became more selective about who he allowed near him, choosing people who were easier to guide, easier to manipulate, easier to separate from the rest of the community. His mind evaluated every person he encountered based on whether they could help him, hinder him, or simply stay ignorant. Control became the lens through which he viewed the world, a quiet obsession that colored every decision he made. And as that obsession grew, his restraint weakened. He started taking bolder steps, small at first, then larger. He traveled more often. He lingered in places where people were less likely to be missed immediately. He experimented with ways to hide his movements. Those experiments taught him more about how easily people looked past details when they assumed they knew someone. And Ray learned quickly, adapting his methods with an unsettling calmness. But despite his discipline, the growing complexity of his double life created strain he could not fully conceal. He began losing track of small details, the things that once came naturally. A neighbor noticed that he seemed startled during a casual conversation. A store clerk noted that he purchased items he didn't usually buy. A friend thought he seemed distracted, almost detached, during a routine visit. These moments were brief, barely noticeable by themselves, but they hinted at the increasing pressure Ray was placing on his own mask. Still, Ray believed he could maintain control. Every mistake he brushed aside. Every crack he filled with new lies. Every moment of tension he managed with the same calm voice he had polished over decades. But beneath his outward composure, something was changing. The boundary between his fantasies and reality had nearly dissolved. The world he built behind closed doors no longer satisfied him on its own. The desert that once comforted him began to feel like a stage, an endless landscape where he believed nothing could touch him. And that belief pushed him past the point of return. Ray no longer questioned whether he could keep his secret life hidden forever. He believed it. Completely. Absolutely. The illusion he built had become his truth. And that truth would soon carry him into the darkest chapter of his life, a chapter the community would never forget, one that would eventually unravel everything he had constructed. For now, though, in the quiet stillness of New Mexico, Ray walked with the confidence of a man who believed he had outsmarted the world. He had not. But the moment he realized that truth was still far ahead. Chapter 8, The Room No One Knew. The small town of Elephant Butte moved with such slow predictability that no one ever imagined anything unusual happening behind the quiet houses and modest yards. People waved to each other across dusty streets, tended to their routines, and trusted the familiarity of the community. But behind the fence of David Parker Ray's property, the desert silence concealed a place that would eventually shock the entire nation, a place he crafted with painstaking patience, absolute secrecy, and a level of planning that revealed just how deeply his private world had detached from reality. This hidden space didn't appear suddenly. It grew piece by piece, shaped by years of planning and reinforced by Ray's unwavering belief that no one would ever uncover what lay behind his closed doors. The desert around him made that belief stronger. Noise didn't carry far out there. Neighbors lived far enough apart that no one watched each other closely. And Ray's reputation as a quiet, trustworthy mechanic made his comings and goings blend into the background of daily life. He understood every advantage the environment gave him, and he used all of them. At first, the structure looked like nothing more than an equipment trailer, weathered metal, reinforced walls, and a kind of appearance that suggested tools and machinery, not secrets. If a neighbor glanced at it, they saw exactly what Ray wanted them to see, a workspace belonging to a man who repaired engines, collected parts, and tinkered with projects no one cared enough to ask about. But inside, it was something far different. Ray designed the space with careful intent, using his mechanical knowledge to fine-tune each detail. He reinforced the interior walls, ensuring that no sound could escape. He added layers of insulation, not for temperature, but for secrecy. He installed multiple locks, not just standard ones, but specialized mechanisms that he adjusted personally, testing them over and over again until he was certain the outside world could never intrude. Every piece of equipment inside had been collected slowly, spaced out over years, never purchased in a way that would draw suspicion. Ray visited salvage yards, hardware stores, and auctions, choosing items that blended perfectly into the identity he presented to the community. To anyone watching, he was just gathering tools for mechanical work. No one questioned him. No one wondered why he needed so much equipment. No one thought twice about the man who always had a new project in progress. And that was exactly what he counted on. Ray approached the construction of this hidden room with the same calm, methodical precision that defined his public life. He measured twice, adjusted angles, tightened bolts, rewired fixtures, and tested systems until everything functioned exactly as he envisioned. He worked slowly, deliberately, never rushing, never making careless decisions. The space became an extension of his mind, organized, controlled, meticulously arranged. To Ray, control wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity. And this hidden room gave him the ultimate sense of it. Inside the space, he arranged shelves, drawers, and compartments with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. Every item had a designated place. Every tool lined up perfectly. Ray liked order. He liked structure. He liked predictability. The room became a kind of private laboratory where he could refine the fantasies that had grown inside him for decades. But more importantly, the room became the foundation of the identity Ray hid from the world, the identity that no neighbor, no friend, no coworker had ever glimpsed. He built it not for chaos, but for control. Not for impulse, but for precision. And with each edition, his confidence grew. He began believing not just that he could hide his second life, but that he was entitled to it. That he had earned the right to create a world that existed entirely outside the moral framework of the community around him. His notebooks filled with sketches and diagrams outlining how to improve the space. He mapped out placement of equipment, airflow adjustments, and security modifications that only he understood. These journals weren't frenzied or chaotic, they were calm, structured, and disturbingly rational. The writing revealed a mind that viewed secrecy as a skill, not a burden. As Ray perfected the interior, he developed a routine that kept the space hidden. He visited the trailer only at times when neighbors were indoors or away. He parked vehicles strategically to block visibility. He kept the exterior appearance intentionally plain. And he made sure he always had a believable excuse ready if anyone happened to ask what he was working on. No one asked. The desert protected him. The town trusted him. And Ray believed, fully, completely, that his hidden room, his private sanctuary of control, would remain undiscovered forever. But what Ray didn't realize was that every secret, no matter how carefully crafted, creates its own gravity. And eventually, that gravity always pulls something into the light. As the hidden room neared completion, Ray's relationship with the space transformed into something deeper than attachment. It became the centerpiece of his identity, the physical representation of fantasies he had nurtured for decades, and the one environment where he felt completely in control. Outside, he remained the quiet mechanic, the polite neighbor, the man who nodded at strangers and helped acquaintances without hesitation. But inside, he became someone else, someone he had spent years constructing internally before he ever built a single wall of the trailer. The shift didn't happen suddenly, it evolved. The more he improved the room, the more intense his private world became. He began spending entire evenings inside, adjusting equipment, cleaning tools, reorganizing shelves. He moved through the space with a calm that bordered on ritual. Everything had to be precise. Everything had to function perfectly. Control was the foundation of the environment, and Ray protected that control fiercely. He began monitoring the area around his property more closely. He kept track of neighbor routines, learning who left for work early, who stayed home during the day, who walked their dogs at specific times. He noted which cars passed through the neighborhood regularly and which ones didn't. None of these habits seemed suspicious to outsiders. Plenty of people in small towns paid attention to their surroundings. But Ray's attention wasn't casual. It was strategic. The more he monitored others, the more he believed he was unseen. And the more he believed he was unseen, the bolder he became. His confidence in the hidden room grew so strong that he eventually convinced himself there was no possibility of discovery. It wasn't just a belief, it became a conviction. He told himself he was smarter than anyone who might look into his life. He told himself that his years of planning made him untouchable. And the desert, silent and unchanging, reinforced that illusion every day. But Ray didn't realize how deeply this confidence was reshaping him. His emotions began flattening around people. Conversations felt like rehearsed performances. His interest in maintaining his public life became mechanical, like a task he completed without emotion. The mask still fit, but he wore it with less effort, not because he was slipping, but because he felt invincible behind it. Ray's journals from this period reflected that shift. His writing became colder, more analytical. His descriptions of the room became clinical, focused on technical details, security upgrades, and careful evaluations of his own behavior. He treated his hidden world like a long-term project, one that required maintenance, attention, and constant refinement. The frightening part wasn't the content, it was the tone. He wrote with the certainty of someone who no longer believed consequences applied to him. The room had become more than a space. It had become proof, in his mind, of his superiority. The very act of hiding it, maintaining it, perfecting it, reinforced the belief that he was beyond detection. But Ray's overconfidence created blind spots he never recognized. The people closest to him started noticing subtle changes, the way he seemed more distracted, the way he lingered in conversations he used to avoid, the way he reacted more sharply when someone asked about his property. None of these moments were enough to spark immediate suspicion, but they planted tiny seeds, the kind that take root quietly and grow slowly. The desert had shaped Ray into a man who believed he could manipulate space, people, and perception indefinitely. But what he failed to see was that every layer of secrecy he added to his life made the structure more unstable. He believed he had built a perfect system. In reality, he had built something brittle, delicate enough that the smallest pressure, the smallest unexpected event, the smallest miscalculation could cause everything to fracture. And that fracture was coming. It would begin not with a dramatic revelation or a sudden collapse, but with a quiet moment, a conversation, a mistake, a detail overlooked after years of confidence. For now, though, Ray moved through his hidden world with the calm certainty of someone who believed he had mastered both sides of his life. He believed he had won. And the desert around him remained. Chapter 9, Hairline Fractures in a Perfect Lie. By the mid-1990s, the life David Parker Ray spent decades constructing was held together by threads thinner than he realized. On the surface, everything appeared the same. He still walked through Elephant Butte with that familiar slow stride, still nodded to neighbors, still kept to himself with a politeness that made no one suspicious. But beneath that calm exterior, the pressure of maintaining two lives had begun working against him in ways he didn't yet understand. Ray believed he had perfected his system, the routines, the secrecy, the careful compartmentalization. In his mind, each part of his life functioned independently, like machines operating in separate rooms. But no system, no matter how carefully built, can withstand the strain of constant maintenance without showing signs of fatigue. The first cracks were too subtle for most people to see. They appeared in small moments, like Ray forgetting details he once managed effortlessly. He repeated himself occasionally, something uncharacteristic of a man who had always spoken with measured precision. He grew more irritated when people lingered near his property, even if they had perfectly innocent reasons. And he reacted with slight but noticeable tension when someone asked even casual questions about his work. These weren't dramatic changes, nothing that screamed danger. But they were deviations from the quiet consistency that had protected him for so long. Ray had spent most of his life analyzing others, but he rarely turned that same scrutiny inward. He didn't see that the more time he spent in his hidden world, the less he understood how he appeared to the community around him. His eyes grew harder without him noticing. His smile thinned. His responses became delayed, as if he were replaying scenarios in his mind instead of engaging with the moment. People didn't know what to make of those changes, so they explained them away. He's just getting older. He's stressed, he's always been different. Those justifications protected him for years. But the truth was that Ray's private world had finally begun affecting his ability to maintain the mask. During this period, he became more protective of his workspace than ever before. He monitored footsteps outside, listened for unfamiliar cars, and memorized the sounds of his environment so intensely that even a minor difference set him on edge. He checked locks twice, sometimes 3 times. He repositioned objects in his trailer with obsessive care. And he kept a closer eye on the people around him, not because they were behaving differently, but because he was. He was no longer confident in his ability to read others with the same clarity he once had. That erosion of certainty created an undercurrent of paranoia, subtle but persistent. Ray had always believed his intelligence outmatched the world around him. But intelligence alone cannot sustain a double life indefinitely. The emotional strain of secrecy, the constant rehearsal of lies, the endless compartmentalizing, all of it slowly wore down the edges of his carefully maintained composure. He began over-explaining simple things. He repeated stories that didn't require explanation. He corrected people on details that didn't matter. It wasn't the kind of behavior that drew attention, but it was the kind that hinted at internal imbalance. And people were beginning to notice, not with suspicion, but with unease. A coworker once remarked that Ray seemed tense lately. A neighbor mentioned he had become more private than usual. A friend said he seemed distracted, almost absent during conversations. These comments didn't alarm anyone, but they reflected a subtle shift in how people experienced him. The man who once blended perfectly now seemed slightly off. Slightly harder to read. Slightly out of sync with the relaxed pace of Elephant Butte. The desert, which had always been Ray's shield, began working against him. The isolation that once made him invisible now made his changes more noticeable. When someone behaves differently in a busy city, it barely registers. But in a quiet community where people see the same faces and hear the same routines every day, even a small deviation feels amplified. The silence of the desert magnified Ray's internal turbulence. Inside his journals, the shift was even clearer. His entries became sharper, shorter, more fragmented. He wrote in clipped observations instead of long, structured notes. He double-checked ideas he once wrote with confidence. He repeated phrases about control, secrecy, and caution with increasing intensity, as if trying to reassure himself that his system still held. The careful precision of earlier years was replaced by a tone that felt strained, a reflection of a mind losing its grip on the stability it once commanded. Ray didn't realize it, but the equilibrium of his double life was slipping. The hidden world had grown too large to conceal effortlessly. The mask he wore had begun to crack under the weight of its own design. And the people around him, even if they couldn't articulate the reason, sensed something shifting in the atmosphere surrounding him. For decades, Ray had been certain the world would never catch up to him. But the gap between his fantasy and reality was closing. And soon, the smallest mistake would be enough to start the unraveling he never thought possible. The turning point in Ray's carefully controlled world didn't come from a dramatic event. It came from a series of small, almost invisible moments that would have meant nothing on their own, but together began to nudge his secret life toward exposure. These moments slipped quietly into his routines, unnoticed at first, but gradually forming a pattern Ray could not completely ignore. It began with people asking more questions than usual. Not because they suspected anything, but because Ray had grown distant. A coworker asked why he had been working later than usual. A neighbor asked what project he was building behind his house. A friend casually wondered why Ray seemed tired lately. These questions were harmless, ordinary in any other life, but to Ray, they felt intrusive. He brushed them off with calm explanations, but each one irritated him more than it should have. He interpreted curiosity as threat, attention as danger. His reactions became slightly sharper, his tone flatter, his patience thinner. The real shift came from something Ray had never considered a risk, the people around him changing. A neighbor moved away. A coworker quit unexpectedly. A familiar routine in town shifted when a business changed ownership. These small disruptions altered the predictable patterns Ray relied on, forcing him to adapt. And Ray, despite his intelligence, struggled with unpredictable change. His mind functioned best when he controlled every variable. But life, especially in a small town, doesn't stay still forever. New people moved in, people who didn't know him, didn't trust him automatically, didn't interpret his quietness as harmless. They noticed things the longtime locals had learned to overlook. They wondered why Ray kept certain areas so restricted. They noticed how carefully he monitored his surroundings. They questioned why he seemed startled by unexpected visits. Their fresh eyes saw what others had dismissed long ago. One moment in particular marked the beginning of Ray's unraveling, even if he didn't recognize it at the time. A neighbor's dog wandered into the corner of his property and began sniffing near one of the concealed access points. Ray hurried out, calmer than he felt, gently calling the dog away while speaking lightly to the owner. The conversation was short, polite, friendly, forgettable to the neighbor. But to Ray, it shook something loose. It reminded him that no matter how careful he was, the world around him wasn't under his control. Those small reminders accumulated. A piece of equipment in his hidden space malfunctioned unexpectedly. A lock that always clicked smoothly caught on the latch. A journal went missing for an entire afternoon before Ray found it under piles of papers he didn't remember moving. These were minor issues, the kind anyone could experience, but Ray interpreted them as signs of vulnerability. Each disruption increased his paranoia, making him double-check things more frequently, relock doors repeatedly, and monitor his surroundings with a level of intensity that risked drawing attention. And then there were the people he once trusted. Individuals who had been pulled into his orbit without understanding the full extent of his private world began noticing the shifts in his demeanor. His instructions became more specific. His expectations became stricter. His explanations became thinner. People who once felt grateful for his help now felt uneasy around him without knowing why. Ray's emotional composure, once the cornerstone of his disguise, began slipping. His calm voice occasionally wavered. His hands trembled slightly during moments of stress. He repeated phrases as if reminding himself of something important. The mask was still intact, but its edges were fraying. And beneath all of this simmered one truth Ray refused to acknowledge. He was losing control of the world he had built. His inner life had grown too large to contain. His outer life had become too fragile to maintain. His confidence had become overconfidence, and overconfidence had become carelessness. And in the quiet community of Elephant Butte, the smallest hint of carelessness can become the first spark of suspicion. Ray didn't see it yet, but the threads of his secret life had begun to pull loose. The desert, which had once protected him, had started whispering signs of the coming collapse. Change was approaching, slow, silent, steady. And the man who believed he could outthink everyone had no idea that the unraveling had. Chapter 10, Whispers in the Dust, the First Signs of Suspicion. For years, the desert around Elephant Butte had acted like a shield for David Parker Ray, absorbing every secret he buried and swallowing every trace of his double life. But the same silence that once protected him began shifting in tone. The landscape didn't change, but the people did. A new sheriff's deputy asked more questions than usual. A local officer, fresh out of training, drove unfamiliar patrol routes. A detective from a neighboring town passed through with a curiosity that felt sharper than Ray expected. These weren't direct threats, not yet, but subtle reminders that the world outside his control was beginning to pay attention. The shift began with what should have been a simple encounter. A woman, shaken, confused, but alive, crossed paths with law enforcement. Her story was fragmented at first, delivered through fear and adrenaline, but certain details caught the attention of the officer she spoke to. Her description didn't align with Ray perfectly, but pieces of her account triggered instinctive caution. Something she said lingered in the deputy's mind after their conversation ended. It wasn't enough for action, not enough for accusation, but enough to form a small question mark, one that officers carried with them like a quiet hum. The early interactions between Ray and law enforcement remained polite. A deputy approached him casually, framed as a routine check, and Ray responded with the same calm tone he always used, measured, soft, and disarmingly benign. He explained his activities with the same vague but comfortable answers that had fooled the town for years. He never rushed. Never hesitated. He watched the officer carefully, adjusting his facial expressions the way one might adjust a dial. And when the conversation ended, Ray felt confident he had steered it perfectly. But he hadn't. The officer walked away feeling something he couldn't quite name, a faint sense of unease, the kind that arises not from evidence but intuition. Ray didn't look nervous. He didn't say anything strange. He didn't contradict himself. But something about the way he held himself, too neutral, too steady, too controlled, made the deputy replay the conversation later that night. Not suspicion, but curiosity. And curiosity is the first small crack in any disguise. Meanwhile, Ray felt a new sensation he rarely experienced: pressure. It didn't come from immediate danger. It came from possibility, the possibility that someone had finally stepped close to a truth he believed he had buried beyond reach. The sensation unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself rehearsing conversations before they happened. He monitored the perimeter of his property more intently than ever. He kept track of patrol car movements with almost obsessive attention. His once calm ritual of checking locks became tense, hurried, and repetitive. What Ray didn't realize was that his subtle changes were visible to others. A neighbor noticed him pacing near his yard one afternoon. A store clerk observed that he seemed quiet in a different way, more watchful, more withdrawn. A coworker commented that Ray seemed tired, unaware that what he was seeing was not exhaustion, but calculation. Ray's confidence in his ability to manipulate perception had been unshakable for decades. But confidence relies on stability, and the emerging cracks in his routine began to destabilize the entire structure of his mask. He became more careful with his words but less intuitive about how they sounded. He planned interactions meticulously but misjudged the emotional tone of conversations. He tried to appear relaxed, but tension seeped subtly into his posture. Law enforcement, still uncertain, began taking small steps out of caution. Additional questions. Quiet checks. Routine follow-ups that felt routine only on the surface. Nothing accusatory, nothing bold, but small signs that something was shifting. Officers didn't know exactly what they were looking for, but they knew they were looking for something. Inside Ray, the psychological divide widened. His hidden world demanded secrecy, his mask demanded calm. But when calm becomes forced, it becomes fragile. And every interaction, every question, every unexpected knock on the door, every passing patrol car, tightened the threads until they began to tremble. Still, Ray told himself he was safe. He reminded himself of how long he had gone unnoticed. He relied on the same logic that had protected him for decades, the belief that people saw what they expected to see. A quiet mechanic. A helpful neighbor. A man with no reason to draw suspicion. But the desert was no longer silent. Whispers had begun to move across its dry winds, whispers that carried from one officer to another, from one neighbor to another, from one piece of small-town conversation to the next. Not accusations. Just echoes of curiosity, passing thoughts that lingered a little too long. Ray continued moving through life as if the world were unchanged. But in the quiet spaces between his rehearsed moments, he felt something he could not ignore, the sense that a shift had begun, tiny, almost invisible, but real. And though he refused to acknowledge it, the path toward his unraveling had already been set in motion. The desert had always been Ray's greatest advantage, vast enough to hide anything, silent enough to swallow secrets, and isolated enough to keep attention away. But as law enforcement grew more attentive, the isolation became a double-edged sword. Where it once protected him, it now made every misstep stand out. Silence no longer hid him, it amplified the sound of change. Officers didn't coordinate at first. They weren't yet forming a case. What they were forming was something softer, a pattern of questions, impressions, and unresolved details that kept pointing back to Ray in subtle ways. One deputy mentioned his name to another. A detective recalled a small inconsistency in Ray's alibi for a particular night. Someone else noted that Ray avoided answering certain questions directly. These weren't accusations, they were fragments, tiny observations collected independently. But fragments, when repeated often enough, begin to resemble a shape. Ray noticed the shift, even if no one said anything directly. He saw patrol cars pass his property more frequently, a few times by coincidence, but enough to make him tense. He heard neighbors mention new officers in town. He observed a lingering glance from a sheriff's deputy one morning at a grocery store. None of these moments were confrontational, but each one pressed against the edges of his confidence. His reactions became increasingly controlled, almost rigid. In public, he maintained the softness of voice that defined him. But his words became shorter, his conversations less natural. His laugh, once an easy tool for disarming suspicion, now appeared forced. People couldn't articulate what felt different, but they could feel it. Human intuition is imperfect, but it is sensitive to changes in energy. And Ray's energy had shifted. Inside his hidden room, Ray spent more time reorganizing than working, not because anything needed adjusting, but because he needed to reassure himself that everything was still under control. He tightened screws, polished surfaces, relabeled compartments, cleaned equipment that was already spotless. These rituals weren't maintenance, they were psychological anchors, attempts to regain a sense of stability slipping from his grasp. Meanwhile, the story that sparked initial curiosity grew sharper in the minds of investigators. They revisited the woman's account, extracting details with more clarity. They compared her description to known residents. They cross-referenced locations. Her memory was fragmented, but certain elements pointed repeatedly toward Ray, not conclusively, but enough to justify further inquiry. Detectives began discreetly discussing his name in internal conversations. They reviewed property records, noting the isolation of his residence. They checked his employment history, observed his patterns, and considered his connections to individuals who had raised concerns in the past. The tone of these discussions wasn't accusatory, just cautious, methodical, and persistent. Ray sensed this gathering storm even without hearing it. A man who spent decades studying human behavior could detect subtle changes in posture, tone, and intention even before others recognized them themselves. And although no officer confronted him directly, Ray perceived the shift in their eyes, a quiet awareness that hadn't been there months earlier. This awareness ignited a growing fear inside him, though he would never admit it. Fear wasn't something Ray allowed himself to feel openly. Instead, it appeared in indirect ways: restless nights, sudden irritability, moments where he paused mid-task as if replaying events in his mind. His internal narration, once confident and orderly, became fractured. He tried to regain control by tightening his routines. He monitored who drove past his home and when. He avoided conversations that drifted too close to personal topics. He limited travel to places where he felt confident he wouldn't be recognized. And yet, despite these precautions, he couldn't quiet the growing sense that time was no longer on his side. The tipping point came quietly, a knock on his door, delivered not with urgency, but with routine professionalism. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't a search warrant. It was simply a request for a conversation, framed as part of an unrelated inquiry. But Ray felt something deeper in that moment, the unmistakable pull of an approaching reckoning. His heart stayed calm, but his mind raced. He answered the questions carefully, politely, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served him for years. But the deputy's eyes were different now, observant, steady, slightly probing. No accusation. But no acceptance, either. Ray closed the door afterward and stood in silence, staring at the floor of his living room as if the boards themselves had betrayed him. The room felt smaller than usual. The desert wind outside seemed louder. The illusion of control, the one he believed he had perfected, felt thinner than ever before. He told himself he could fix it. He told himself he had survived closer calls before. But deep inside, he felt something new. The sense that the world was no longer looking away. The net hadn't closed yet, but the first knots had tightened. And the man who believed he could outthink everyone had finally begun to realize that someone was thinking about him.
Chapter 11, Cracks in the Illusion, the community begins to notice. As the months passed, the subtle unease surrounding David Parker Ray continued to grow. It didn't announce itself loudly, it didn't arrive with sirens or accusations. Instead, it appeared like a quiet draft slipping through cracks in a window, barely felt at first, then impossible to ignore. People in the small town scattered around Elephant Butte began noticing things they couldn't explain, little inconsistencies in the behavior of a man they had always considered quiet, even forgettable. Neighbors who once saw Ray as simply a reclusive mechanic now noticed details they had overlooked for years. The way he watched the road from his driveway. The way he paused conversations mid-sentence, as if recalculating his words. The way he locked his property with an intensity no one else in the area felt necessary. No one pointed fingers. This was a town where suspicion didn't come easily, but people began remembering these moments long after they occurred. Ray felt this shift deeply. He felt it in the lingering glances people gave him at the general store. He felt it in the hesitant tone of a coworker who once spoke to him freely. He felt it in the pauses that followed his entrance into a room, even if the conversations resumed moments later. It wasn't confrontation, it was distance. And distance, in small communities, can be louder than words. His attempts to maintain normalcy became strained. He volunteered to help a neighbor with a small repair, but his usually calm demeanor cracked slightly under the surface. His movements were too quick, too deliberate, as though performing the role of a friendly neighbor rather than simply being one. The woman he helped later told her husband she couldn't explain it, but something felt off. She wasn't afraid of Ray, just unsettled, in a way she couldn't articulate. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued piecing together fragments of information without yet realizing the full picture. A detective in Truth or Consequences noted that Ray's name came up multiple times in unrelated inquiries. A deputy recalled a conversation in which Ray seemed unusually guarded about his schedule. A sheriff across the county mentioned hearing rumors about a strange man near the lake from a couple passing through. These weren't leads, not yet, but they were threads. And threads, when gathered by the right hands, eventually form patterns. Ray sensed the attention building even before he heard any questions directly. He had always prided himself on reading people well, on predicting their behavior before they acted. So when a deputy's tone shifted, when a neighbor's smile felt forced, when someone asked a question that seemed too specific, he recognized the signs instantly. And being known, even slightly, was Ray's deepest fear. To counter this emerging tension, Ray adjusted his behavior. He tried to appear more relaxed, offering small talk where he normally would have stayed silent. He opened conversations with light humor, hoping to ease the fog of unease he sensed around him. But this newfound friendliness felt unnatural to those who knew him. People sometimes respond more to inconsistencies than to negativity, and Ray's sudden attempts at warmth didn't feel like warmth at all. They felt like performance. The desert around him, once a comforting expanse of isolation, now felt exposed. Every sound, a car engine in the distance, footsteps on gravel, the crackle of radios from passing patrol vehicles, carried new meaning. Ray began spending more time inside, moving carefully, listening. His usual routines became slower, sharper, more deliberate. He checked the windows more often. He left lights on in rooms he normally kept dark. He reviewed conversations in his head at night, replaying them line by line. Meanwhile, within law enforcement, interest in Ray remained low-level but persistent. Officers didn't yet know what they were looking for, but they knew something wasn't right. A new detective, reviewing old notes from an unrelated case, noticed that Ray's name appeared in several reports where it didn't quite belong. Not in connection with wrongdoing, simply mentioned. But mentioned enough to spark curiosity. He reached out to a colleague, asking, "What do you know about this guy?" The answer he received was vague, but not reassuring. Quiet. Keeps to himself. Nothing on him, but something's odd. The detective didn't know what odd meant. He just wrote the word into his notes and circled it. Ray, as intuitive as ever, sensed that his usual invisibility was faltering. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, not openly, not definitively, but quietly. People weren't dismissing him anymore, they were remembering him. And memory, he realized, was more dangerous than accusation. This subtle shift weighed on him heavily. His nights grew restless. His routines grew rigid. His attempts to maintain control felt increasingly fragile. He scrutinized every interaction, every glance, every minor comment that might suggest others were thinking about him more than before. And while no one had spoken his name with suspicion aloud, the silence around him felt different now, not empty, but watchful. Cracks and illusions don't appear dramatically. They form slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And as Ray moved through his days trying to maintain the mask he had worn for decades, he didn't realize that the mask had already begun to slip, not from one large mistake, but from a series of small, almost imperceptible changes that others had finally begun to see. The next shift, the one that would turn quiet suspicion into real inquiry, was approaching. And Ray felt it, even if he didn't yet know where it would come from. In the weeks that followed, the tone of the community continued to shift. Conversations that once drifted easily across backyards and store aisles now carried quiet caution whenever Ray's name came up. Again, nothing spoken outright, only soft, ambiguous comments like, "He's been acting strange lately," or, "Hard to tell what that guy's thinking." In a small town, these murmurs accumulate like dust, settling into the edges of local awareness until they become part of the landscape. Law enforcement, too, continued gathering small fragments of information that seemed unrelated until viewed together. A detective reviewing older missing persons cases found a mention of Ray's presence near a location tied to one of the disappearances. A sheriff recalled an incident where Ray seemed unusually defensive about questions regarding his daily routine. A report from a nearby county referenced a vague description of a truck that loosely resembled his. These bits of information weren't enough for action, not yet, but they created something harder to dismiss, a feeling. One evening, as dusk settled over the desert, two officers met casually in a parking lot behind the sheriff's office, discussing unrelated cases. Ray's name surfaced again, almost casually. "He's been mentioned in a few things lately," one of them said. "Probably nothing, but strange how his name keeps popping up." The other officer nodded slowly. "Maybe we should look at him a little closer. Just in case." That single suggestion marked the moment when the small, scattered fragments in their mind started forming their first faint outline. Not an accusation, but a direction. Ray didn't know about the conversation, but he sensed the shift through intuition alone. He always did. People's energy had changed around him. Officers didn't linger as long in conversation, but their eyes lingered longer. Their questions seemed harmless, but they were too precise, too carefully phrased to be casual. One afternoon, Ray saw a patrol car pause briefly near the edge of his driveway before continuing down the road. It didn't stop. It didn't even slow enough to raise suspicion in another person. But Ray noticed the hesitation, the slight reduction in speed, the angle of the deputy's gaze. Someone else might have dismissed it as coincidence. But Ray's mind, always alert to potential threats, marked it immediately. Inside his home that night, Ray stood in the middle of his living room without turning on the lights. The fading evening glow cast long shadows across the floor. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply listened, to the wind outside, to the ticking of the clock on the wall, to the quiet that once comforted him but now felt heavy. He wasn't afraid, at least not in a way he recognized as fear. What he felt was a growing awareness of vulnerability. A recognition that the protective blanket of invisibility he had worn for so long was thinning. He reassured himself with logic: they had no evidence, no reason to focus on him, no concrete suspicion. But logic couldn't silence instinct. And Ray's instinct told him that people were beginning to see him differently. Meanwhile, officers began taking small but deliberate steps to learn more. They reviewed his property records. They checked his employment background. They asked quiet questions in the community, phrased gently, to avoid causing alarm. How well do you know him? Ever notice anything unusual? He ever mention anything strange to you? Most people answered the same way, not really. He's quiet. Keeps to himself. But the tone of these answers, thoughtful, distant, uncertain, only reinforced officers' curiosity. One deputy went to the lake area one afternoon and casually observed Ray from a distance as he worked. Ray didn't see him, but the deputy watched long enough to form a stronger impression. The man's movements seemed methodical, almost rehearsed. His gaze moved constantly, scanning the environment even when he appeared to be focused on a task. The deputy couldn't shake the feeling that Ray was always watching for something, or someone. That same deputy reported his observations to a superior later that day. Not as a formal concern. Not as suspicion. But as a note that Ray might warrant further attention. Slowly, the idea spread among a few more officers. No one was ready to act, but they were beginning to look, quietly, from a distance, gathering information without alerting Ray or the community. Ray, however, perceived the shift long before it became visible. He spent more time indoors. He rehearsed potential conversations with law enforcement in his mind, preparing answers that sounded casual but were carefully constructed. He adjusted his routines to avoid predictable patterns. He scanned his environment constantly, searching for signs of surveillance even where none existed. Every small interaction became a test. Every conversation, an evaluation. He measured people's words, their expressions, their tone. He studied their reactions to him with the same precision he once used to study mechanical systems. The mask he had worn for decades didn't fall, but it tightened, becoming more rigid, more controlled. And the more rigid a mask becomes, the easier it is to crack. The quiet observation from law enforcement, combined with the growing unease of the community, created the conditions for a shift that would soon become irreversible. It wasn't a single clue or a dramatic revelation. It was pressure, slow, steady, quiet pressure, that was beginning to close in from all sides. And as Ray moved through the desert evenings, feeling the weight of invisible eyes. Chapter 12, The First Real Break, a lead begins to form. By the time late summer drifted into the desert, law enforcement no longer saw David Parker Ray as just another quiet local. He wasn't a suspect, nowhere near it, but his presence had shifted from an anonymous name on paper to a person worth monitoring. In small towns where everyone knew everyone, this alone was unusual. Officers didn't focus on people without reason, not when resources were scarce and the region was stretched thin. Yet, something kept pulling their attention back to Ray. It began with a conversation between two detectives from different jurisdictions, each working cases they didn't yet realize connected in any way. Over a cup of coffee in a cramped conference room, one detective mentioned encountering a woman whose story was fragmented but troubling. The other detective noted a separate case involving a young person who had reported escaping a situation they couldn't fully describe. The circumstances didn't match perfectly, but certain themes overlapped: confusion, fear, fragmented memories, references to a strange room and a man with a calm voice. They compared notes. Some details shifted. Others aligned too closely to ignore. Even then, Ray's name wasn't at the forefront. But his property, isolated, secured, rarely visited, came up in the conversation. They both knew the area well. They knew the type of people who lived there. And they both agreed that of everyone in that remote stretch, Ray stood out, not because he drew attention, but because he avoided it so precisely. Still, these weren't leads. At least not yet. They were impressions, quiet, subtle, and easy to overlook. But in investigations, impressions often mark the beginning of clarity. Meanwhile, Ray sensed none of these conversations directly, but he felt the consequences indirectly. The world around him was shifting in small ways that caught his attention. A sheriff's deputy parked near his property longer than usual before driving away. A state trooper passed by twice in the same afternoon, something Ray couldn't remember happening before. A detective he didn't recognize stood at the counter of a local hardware store at the same time he was there, glancing at him twice, maybe 3 times. Ray wasn't paranoid, he was perceptive. He could distinguish random behavior from intentional behavior with uncanny accuracy, a skill he'd honed over decades. And what he saw now didn't feel random. Inside law enforcement offices across multiple counties, conversations continued. A lieutenant suggested pulling older reports that mentioned Ray's name or property. A sergeant agreed to quietly contact officers who knew the area well. A detective volunteered to drive out to Elephant Butte, not to confront Ray, but to revisit sites where previous incidents had occurred. The tone of these conversations was quiet, cautionary rather than accusatory. Still, they marked the first real pivot in the investigation. People were no longer wondering if Ray should be looked at. They were beginning to question why he hadn't been looked at earlier. And this shift opened the door for the first significant break. It arrived through a woman who had no connection to Ray, law enforcement, or the prior incidents. She wasn't trying to report anything. She simply shared a story with a friend, a story about seeing something unusual near the lake one night months earlier. She described a parked vehicle with its lights off, its silhouette partially hidden behind a cluster of desert brush. She never saw the driver clearly, but she remembered the color of the truck and the way it left the area as soon as she drove closer. Her friend mentioned the story to her husband. The husband repeated it during a casual conversation with an off-duty deputy. The deputy found the detail familiar and looked through old notes. And when he found what he was looking for, a description that was eerily similar to the one he'd taken months before, he logged it and brought it to the attention of his supervisor the next morning. There, on the page, was the first real connection. Not proof. Not certainty. But a line drawn between 2 previously separate moments. And the truck. It matched Ray's. This prompted a meeting, understated, brief, but important. A small group of officers gathered in a quiet room, away from the usual noise of the station. They reviewed every report, every conversation, every piece of information involving the area around Elephant Butte. They discussed Ray's truck. His property. His habits. His limited social circle. The strange stories overheard in the community. The more they talked, the more the name, David Parker Ray, recurred. Not loudly, but consistently. For the first time, they agreed they needed more information. Not a search. Not a confrontation. Just knowledge. One detective suggested conducting casual interviews. Another planned to review Ray's background in more detail. A third officer volunteered to discreetly monitor his residence from a distance. No one suspected what lay behind the walls of Ray's home. No one imagined a hidden world. But they sensed something was off, deeply off, and they were no longer willing to ignore it. Ray, however, had no idea that the first true break in the case had occurred. No idea that strangers were beginning to connect dots he thought could never be connected. But he felt something else. A growing tension in the air around him. A shift in the way people looked at him. A new weight in the silence of the desert. The calm, predictable world he had relied on for so long was beginning to tilt. Slowly. Quietly. But undeniably. A week after the internal meeting among detectives, Ray received an unexpected visitor. It wasn't a warrant. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even formally investigative. It was, on the surface, a simple conversation, one of the many small interactions officers conducted in rural New Mexico as part of routine follow-ups. But Ray felt the weight behind it the moment he opened the door. A deputy stood on his porch, hands resting calmly on his belt, posture relaxed. He greeted Ray with a polite smile and a neutral tone, the kind officers use when they want to avoid triggering defensiveness. The questions he asked were everyday questions, framed casually, almost conversationally. But Ray heard the subtext beneath them instantly. The deputy asked about certain nights, certain people, certain locations. He didn't accuse Ray of anything, but he was checking patterns, looking for gaps, observing reactions. He wasn't interrogating, he was studying. Ray answered carefully, keeping his tone steady, his voice relaxed. But inside, his mind raced, analyzing each question, calculating each answer, measuring the deputy's micro-reactions. This was a game of nuance, one Ray had played many times before, but this time the stakes felt different. When the deputy thanked him and turned to leave, Ray felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, doubt. Not fear, doubt. Doubt that the mask he had worn for so long was as impenetrable as he believed. Doubt that silence, charm, and patience would continue to shield him. The deputy walked away casually, but as soon as he returned to his vehicle, he wrote a note in his log. Ray didn't slip, contradict himself, or act outwardly nervous. But something about him felt off, too prepared, too measured. Investigators noticed this detail later, and it confirmed what they had been slowly realizing. Ray wasn't just reclusive. He was cautious. And people don't become cautious without reason. In the days afterward, Ray's world tightened even further. He watched every car that drove past, trying to determine whether its presence was routine or intentional. He monitored the patterns of neighbor activity. He avoided public places whenever possible, worried that even small interactions might give away something he didn't intend to show. His internal monologue grew tense. Each morning he replayed the previous day in his mind. Each night he planned the next day meticulously. His once calm routines were now rigid defense mechanisms. He felt eyes on him even when alone, not because he was being watched, but because he didn't know if he was being watched. And when uncertainty creeps in, it grows fast. Meanwhile, law enforcement expanded their quiet inquiry. Background checks. Contact with agencies in other counties. Organized summaries of every report linked to the lake area. They weren't building a case, they were building understanding. But the more they learned, the more uneasy they became. Ray had no significant criminal record. No prior arrests. No obvious motive for wrongdoing. But the patterns, the subtle details, were enough to justify continued interest. And Ray, who had always stayed 10 steps ahead of people, suddenly felt only 1 step ahead. Inside him, an internal shift began, not panic, but heightened vigilance. He became more sensitive to sound, more aware of motion, more alert to the slightest change in behavior around him. The desert, once a refuge, now felt like a stage. And in the growing quiet, a truth began to crystallize. People were noticing him. People were asking about him. People were talking about him. For a man who had lived behind walls of secrecy for decades, this was the first true sign that the world he built was beginning to crack. More questions were coming. More eyes were turning his way. And soon, the pressure he felt would evolve into something far more dangerous. Chapter 13, The Circle Tightens, Investigators Connect the Dots. As autumn settled over Elephant Butte, the small law enforcement agencies scattered across southern New Mexico found themselves drawn into a conversation that none of them had anticipated. Separate cases that once seemed isolated now began to share faint echoes. Statements from witnesses, fragmented, shakily delivered, but sincere, carried similar details. Places that once seemed unconnected now appeared on overlapping maps. Descriptions that sounded vague began to resemble one another in tone and detail. At the center of these quiet realizations, one name kept resurfacing. David Parker Ray. It wasn't that Ray had done anything overt to attract attention. Quite the opposite, he had spent a lifetime cultivating the art of invisibility. His demeanor was calm, his lifestyle unremarkable, his movements predictable. But predictability can be suspicious when remnants of unexplained events line up too neatly around it. Investigators met in a small office one afternoon, their discussion beginning with routine case updates and ending with an undeniable shift in focus. A detective pinned a map to the wall and marked several locations tied to various reports. When he stepped back, the cluster of pins around the Elephant Butte area was difficult to ignore. Another officer added a few notes from a separate inquiry. A third brought up the earlier mention of Ray's vehicle being sighted near an odd location at an odd hour. The room grew quiet. No one said Ray's name at first. Silence stretched, thoughtful and heavy. Then finally, someone broke it. Why is he near all these places? The question hung in the air without an answer. They didn't jump to conclusions, these were methodical people, trained to avoid assumptions and emotional leaps. But the facts, thin as they were, began gravitating toward one another like metal shavings to a magnet. Reports involving confusion, fear, and incomplete memories. A reclusive man with a secure property no one had reason to visit. A truck description repeated twice in unrelated incidents. A neighborhood whisper that he keeps to himself too much. Individually, none of these mattered. Together, they formed a faint but undeniable pattern. Meanwhile, Ray sensed this shift without knowing any specifics. The desert air felt different to him, thicker, charged with unseen attention. His instincts sharpened further, telling him that something was unfolding behind the scenes, something he couldn't control. He noticed the deeper subtleties. A deputy who drove slower past his road. A detective at a gas station who asked him the same question twice. A neighbor who stopped greeting him as warmly as before. None of these were direct signs of suspicion, but Ray didn't need direct signs. His life had been built on reading people with near-clinical precision. And what he saw now alarmed him more than he let himself admit. He tried to anchor himself in routine, early mornings, quiet days, predictable movements. But his routines now carried tension. He watched every passing vehicle. He paused before answering every knock on the door. He rehearsed conversations in his head, fine-tuning answers until they became almost mechanical. Law enforcement, unaware of the psychological pressure they were placing on him, continued quietly gathering information. Background checks revealed nothing extraordinary, but that nothingness itself raised eyebrows. It's rare for a person to leave so few impressions on a community. Rare, and sometimes troubling. A senior investigator pointed this out in a meeting. You ever notice how there's almost no gossip about him? He's lived out there for years. People don't have opinions. They just shrug. That shrug carried weight. It wasn't indifference, it was unfamiliarity. Ray was a ghost in his own town, known by name but not by presence. These insights pushed the team toward a new decision: they needed more context. They needed to talk to people who had worked with Ray, interacted with him, or lived near him. They needed to understand how someone could exist so quietly in a place where quiet itself attracted attention. Thus began a series of discreet interviews. Co-workers described Ray as polite but private. Neighbors said he was helpful but distant. A clerk at a local store recalled him being calm in a way you don't see often. These descriptions weren't negative, but none of them felt human. Not friendly. Not unfriendly. Just flat. Investigators left those conversations with more questions. Ray felt the ripple effects of these quiet inquiries. He noticed someone asking a little too many questions about him at the mechanic shop. He overheard a neighbor mentioning that people from town were curious about the lake area. He caught his own name spoken softly behind him in a store, not in accusation, but curiosity. And curiosity, Ray knew, was the first step toward discovery. At night, Ray sat alone in his living room with no lights on, surrounded by the hum of the desert wind, listening as if the silence itself carried meaning. His thoughts ran in loops. His internal calculations grew more complex, more frantic, yet outwardly he remained composed. He told himself he still had the advantage. He told himself he still controlled the narrative. He told himself the desert was still on his side. But deep down, he understood what was happening. People were beginning to look at him closely. People were beginning to notice inconsistencies. People were beginning to connect dots he thought were too far apart to join. As law enforcement's interest in Ray quietly grew, the psychological pressure inside him deepened in ways he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. He had long prided himself on maintaining absolute emotional control, compartmentalizing his thoughts so effectively that not even those closest to him could sense the complexity beneath his calm surface. But the human mind, even one as disciplined as Ray's, can only withstand mounting pressure for so long. He felt it first in the mornings, waking earlier than usual, sometimes before sunrise. The desert light hadn't yet touched the horizon when Ray would stand at his window, watching the empty road leading toward his home. Every distant engine sound caught his attention. Every dust cloud stirred by the wind made him pause. His senses were tuned to the smallest details, as if anticipating something he couldn't yet see. During the day, he moved like a man trying to avoid being noticed, yet aware he already was. His steps grew quieter, his posture more defensive. He found himself double-checking locks, doors, windows, not out of fear of intrusion, but out of fear of discovery. The ritual calmed him, even if only momentarily. Interactions, even the simplest ones, felt different now. A cashier asked how he was doing. Ray hesitated a moment too long before answering. A coworker mentioned seeing an unfamiliar car near the lake. Ray asked too many follow-up questions. People didn't accuse him of anything. They didn't suspect anything openly. But they sensed a subtle change in him, an intensity behind his calmness, a hesitation beneath his speech, a watchfulness in his eyes that wasn't there before. Ray thought he was hiding these shifts. He wasn't. Meanwhile, investigators continued piecing together their quiet mosaic of information. A deputy retrieved field notes from a previous call involving a frightened woman. A detective dug deeper into Ray's past employment history, noticing gaps that didn't make sense. A sergeant asked a mental health professional to provide insight into evasive behavior patterns, framing the question generally rather than personally. All these pieces began forming something real, something that pointed toward Ray not merely as an odd figure but as someone whose life warranted closer scrutiny. Ray sensed the investigation tightening, even though he didn't know its timeline. When a patrol car slowed near his property twice in one day, he began to time its route, each pass increasing his tension. When a detective casually greeted him in town, Ray replayed every second of the interaction later that night, analyzing tone, posture, intention. His internal world became dominated by vigilance. His external world remained eerily calm. At night, he found himself standing outside at the edge of his property, staring into the darkness stretching across the desert. The silence that once soothed him now felt like an echo of something approaching, something inevitable. He would take deep breaths, telling himself he remained in control, but the thoughts swirling inside him contradicted the calm expression he wore on his face. The desert was vast, but no longer protective. It felt watching. Listening. Ray reminded himself that investigators had nothing concrete. No evidence. No cause for action. But he also understood that investigations don't always begin with evidence. Sometimes they begin with instinct, the same instinct that had allowed him to avoid detection for so long. Now, that instinct worked against him, alerting him to dangers before they became visible. And he could feel danger coming. The illusion he built over decades, the illusion of the quiet, helpful, harmless man, was fracturing. Slowly at first, then faster in the places where the pressure was strongest. The innocence in his voice began sounding too controlled. The calm in his eyes began looking too staged. The routine of his days began feeling like the countdown to something he couldn't stop. Investigators didn't know what they were closing in on. Ray didn't know what they suspected. But both sides understood that momentum had shifted. And momentum, once shifted, rarely reverses. This chapter of Ray's life, the quiet prelude before everything unraveled, was built not of dramatic events but of subtle psychological tension. Of glances that lasted a beat too long. Of questions asked too gently. Of steps taken by law enforcement that seemed harmless but carried growing weight. Ray wasn't caught yet. He wasn't exposed. But he was no longer invisible. For the first time, people were looking at him not through the lens of familiarity, but through the lens of curiosity. And curiosity, once lit, doesn't go out easily. The circle had tightened. The pressure had built. And the next phase in the quiet unraveling of David Parker Ray was about to begin. Chapter 14, The Watching Begins, Quiet Surveillance in the Desert. By the time winter settled over Elephant Butte, the investigation into David Parker Ray had shifted from curiosity to intent. It wasn't formal. It wasn't aggressive. Not yet. But officers were no longer simply gathering scattered pieces of information, they were actively watching him, studying him, learning the rhythms of his life in ways Ray never anticipated. This change didn't happen all at once. It began quietly, almost invisibly, the way large shifts often do. A detective parked along the highway a little longer than usual. A deputy timed how long Ray spent in town. Another officer took note of which days Ray drove his truck and which days he stayed home. None of this was documented as official surveillance. It was informal observation, the kind that law enforcement uses when their instincts tell them something is wrong long before they can prove it. Slowly, the patterns emerged. Ray rarely left town without purpose. He avoided unnecessary conversations. He never deviated from certain routines, unless he seemed stressed. And lately, he seemed stressed often. Detectives noticed this not through big behaviors, but through small cracks in his mask. He answered questions too quickly at times, too slowly at others. His voice, normally calm and measured, occasionally trembled before settling. His gaze drifted toward exits more often, as if mapping escape routes subconsciously. These subtle signs didn't go unnoticed. One evening, two detectives met at a small diner off the main road. Between steaming cups of coffee, they quietly reviewed everything they knew. Ray's property. His routines. The unclear statements from witnesses. The disturbing similarities in independent accounts from people who couldn't possibly know each other. None of it was enough for action. But it was enough to justify the next step, surveillance. They decided on a rotation. Nothing intense. Nothing obvious. Officers would drive by Ray's property at different times, observe from distances, note changes in behavior. If Ray noticed, well, that in itself would be valuable information. And Ray did notice. He saw the same cruiser pass twice in one afternoon. He recognized a detective's vehicle idling near the lake for longer than usual. He caught sight of an unfamiliar truck parked down the road one evening, engine off, barely visible. Ray's instincts sharpened instantly. His internal alarms blared. He understood what was happening. He wasn't being accused. He wasn't being confronted. But he was being watched. This realization hit him with a clarity he couldn't ignore. The mask he had worn for decades, the one built with patience, charm, and careful consistency, suddenly felt fragile. Not broken, but cracking. Inside his home, Ray began adjusting everything. His routines became unpredictable. His movements became measured. He avoided leaving his property unless absolutely necessary. He changed the lights he kept on at night. He double-checked locks even more obsessively. Every sound outside, every distant engine, every unfamiliar silhouette quickened his pulse. He tried reminding himself that law enforcement had nothing concrete on him. He tried convincing himself that he still held control. But the human mind reacts to pressure whether or not the threat is real, and Ray's mind was no exception. Meanwhile, detectives began building a profile, not of guilt, but of behavior. They noted Ray's increased anxiety, his avoidance of casual interaction, his hesitation during simple questions. They reviewed past statements from people who knew him, highlighting inconsistencies they had missed before. They weren't certain of anything. But their instincts were sharpening. One detective phrased it perfectly during a late-night meeting. "He behaves like a man with something to hide." Another detective replied quietly. "Or like someone who thinks we know something, even if we don't." That statement revealed an important truth. Investigators still didn't know what they were circling. But Ray believed they knew more than they did, and that belief was beginning to unravel him. In the following days, Ray's tension grew even more visible. His polite tone became thinner, his answers shorter. He avoided eye contact with officers, something he had never done before. His calm, controlled demeanor, once eerily consistent, now flickered under pressure. Detectives took note. They didn't know the full story. They didn't know what Ray was hiding. But they knew, without doubt, that something was wrong. And that was enough for them to take the next step. They prepared to escalate the investigation, quietly, strategically, methodically. Ray, standing alone in his home surrounded by the weight of silence, felt the change before he saw it. A storm was building. He could feel it in his bones. The days that followed marked a psychological turning point for David Parker Ray, a shift in which the world he once controlled so easily began shrinking around him. Not physically, but mentally. The desert, once his ally, seemed less silent now. Less empty. Less safe. He found himself second-guessing every sound outside. Was that a coyote's call? Or a car door shutting quietly? Every gust of wind made him pause and listen. Every vehicle approaching in the distance tightened his chest before he realized it wasn't stopping. The uncertainty wore on him. Ray had built his life around predictability, predictable days, predictable conversations, predictable outcomes. Predictability was safety. Predictability was control. But now, nothing felt predictable anymore. He didn't know when officers would drive by. He didn't know who was talking to whom. He didn't know what had been said behind closed doors or what evidence, if any, law enforcement had gathered. This mental fog amplified his paranoia. Ray began taking long, isolated walks around his property at night, scanning the horizon for signs of movement or glints of reflected headlights. He lingered near windows, watching for shadows. He unplugged and replugged household devices, convinced that someone might be recording him. These were the behaviors of a man trying desperately to regain control in a world that was slipping from his grasp. His stress didn't go unnoticed. Ray's coworker asked casually, "You okay, man? You seem tired." Ray brushed it off with a forced smile, saying he'd been working late. But the coworker didn't believe him. Something in Ray's eyes looked unsettled, far deeper than fatigue. At the grocery store, a cashier noticed him scanning the room constantly instead of browsing as usual. A neighbor observed Ray standing outside his house late at night, staring at the road for several minutes without moving. People mentioned these observations quietly, not as gossip, but out of unease. They couldn't define the feeling Ray gave them now, but it wasn't the feeling of a harmless recluse anymore. Meanwhile, investigators intensified their efforts. They re-examined old reports with new eyes. They interviewed people who had once interacted with Ray, asking deeper questions. They mapped out locations tied to various incidents and noticed the unsettling proximity to Ray's property. Still no proof, but more weight behind the suspicion. A detective proposed installing temporary surveillance near Ray's road, purely to document his movements. Not a full stakeout, but something close. The team agreed. And Ray sensed it immediately. One morning, while driving into town, he saw a dust trail on a side road that didn't make sense, too slow to be a local, too steady to be accidental. His heartbeat quickened. His mind raced. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. When he parked near a hardware store, he sat in his truck for several minutes before getting out, scanning the area, calculating escape routes even though he had nowhere to escape to. Law enforcement noticed his hypervigilance. They noted his delays. They noted the tension in his posture. They noted the way he watched them now, more carefully than they watched him. One detective said. Quietly. He knows something's happening. He's feeling the heat. Ray wasn't panicking, not yet. But he was unraveling. Inside his home, he started pacing in ways he never had before. He reorganized rooms unnecessarily. He kept a notepad filled with scribbles, names, dates, theories, paranoid predictions. He replayed conversations with officers in his head dozens of times, analyzing every inflection, every pause. He believed they were building a case against him. He believed they had enough to take action. He believed his world was collapsing. And belief can be as powerful as truth. Investigators, unaware of the specifics of Ray's spiraling internal state, continued quietly building momentum. They still didn't have tangible evidence, but they had enough suspicion to keep pushing forward. They sensed a discovery was coming. They just didn't know when. Ray sensed the discovery too. He just didn't know how much time he had left. The distance between these two perspectives, investigators on the verge of uncovering something, and Ray on the verge of losing everything, set the stage for the final unraveling. Both sides knew something was near. Neither understood how close they truly were. Chapter 15, When the Quiet Breaks, the Final Slip. The shift from suspicion to action rarely happens with a dramatic moment. More often, it begins with a whisper, a detail overlooked, a pattern finally noticed, a confession spoken by someone who never intended to speak at all. For the investigation into David Parker Ray, that shift began on an otherwise uneventful morning, when a single conversation revealed more than anyone expected. Detectives gathered at the sheriff's office, reviewing the informal notes collected over the past few weeks, Ray's anxious behavior, unusual movements, changes in routine. They still lacked evidence, but the weight of unease was heavy enough to warrant a deeper look. One officer suggested revisiting an old. Slipping meant vulnerability. Slipping meant opportunity. Slipping meant the mask was weakening. Investigators understood what that meant. If Ray was losing control of his carefully built persona, it wouldn't be long before something tangible surfaced, something they could act on legally and safely. They decided to increase surveillance, but still quietly. They didn't want to spook him into retreating deeper into isolation. Instead, they planned to keep steady eyes on him, watching for inconsistencies, listening for unusual behavior, and documenting everything. Meanwhile, Ray felt the tightening circle more clearly than ever. He woke with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. He felt eyes on him even when no one was around. He timed every movement, monitored every sound, and studied the sky the way some people study clocks. His world was shrinking, and he knew it. One evening, he stepped outside with a flashlight, scanning the property. The beam moved slowly across the desert earth, illuminating dust and brush and the skeletal remains of dry plants. Nothing unusual. Nothing threatening. But his hand trembled slightly as he held the light. Ray was beginning to lose trust in his own instincts. Inside the house, he sat in the quiet, staring at the walls that had once felt protective. They now felt like boundaries closing in. He knew the police were watching him. He didn't know how much they knew or what they suspected, but he recognized the signs. He recognized the distance in their voices, the way they observed instead of conversed. He recognized the widening gap between his answers and their reactions. He could feel the investigation gaining momentum, even without evidence. In moments of rare clarity, Ray considered leaving town, not fleeing, but distancing himself. He imagined relocating temporarily, giving authorities less access to him. But he didn't follow through. Something held him in place. Routine. Pride. The belief that he could still control the statement from years earlier, a comment made by someone who had known Ray briefly, who described him as a man who hides things too carefully. The comment seemed vague at the time. Now, it felt significant. That afternoon, a detective followed the thread, tracking down the individual who had made the remark. What began as a simple conversation quickly expanded into something more revealing. The individual, older now, weathered by time and experience, remembered Ray clearly. His habits. His detached calm. And one moment that had unsettled them deeply. He was always too careful, the person said softly, shaking their head. Not paranoid, prepared. Like he expected something to go wrong someday. The word struck the detective. Prepared. Not paranoid. Prepared suggested intention. Prepared suggested structure. Prepared suggested planning. This was the first external validation of what investigators had begun to suspect: Ray's tension wasn't random. It was the cracking of a system he had maintained for years, perhaps decades. Back at headquarters, the team re-evaluated the entire timeline. They noted the increasing reports of Ray acting strangely. They catalogued the subtle shifts in his demeanor, avoiding eye contact, hesitating before answering questions, watching officers closely. They listed individuals who had interacted with Ray and reported unease, discomfort, or strange encounters that they had dismissed at the time. The room grew quiet. Then a detective said the words that changed everything. "I think he's slipping." It wasn't meant dramatically. It was said calmly, like an observation about the weather. But the tone carried weight, a weight that shifted the room's focus instantly. Narrative? He wasn't sure. The truth was simpler: Ray didn't know how to operate outside his established patterns. Control, to him, meant familiarity. Leaving would mean unpredictability, and unpredictability was dangerous. So he stayed. And detectives watched. Days later, the break investigators needed finally emerged, not through a planned operation, not through advanced technology, but through a simple oversight on Ray's part. A moment of tiredness. A moment of distraction. A moment where the mask slipped just long enough for someone close to him to notice something out of place. That person, alarmed by what they saw, didn't confront Ray. They contacted authorities instead. And with that, the quiet began to break. The investigation, until now a slow-moving current beneath the surface, suddenly felt charged, alive. Detectives leaned in. Supervisors approved additional resources. A focus that had been broad and scattered now narrowed sharply toward Ray's property and his movements. Ray remained unaware of the exact turning point, but he felt the shift like a change in air pressure. He sensed the walls inching closer. He sensed a presence behind every shadow. His routines became frantic. His attempts at control grew sloppy. He repeated conversations in his head, trying to identify where he had gone wrong. He couldn't. Investigators pressed forward. Ray retreated inward. And the distance between them grew thinner with each passing day. The moment of collision was approaching, slowly, steadily, inevitably. And this time, Ray wouldn't be able to stop it. Once authorities received the troubling information from the concerned witness, the tone of the investigation changed instantly. What had previously been a cautious, observational effort now shifted into strategic, coordinated action. They didn't have enough for an arrest, not yet, but they had something far more valuable: direction. Evidence gathering intensified. Detectives mapped Ray's timeline with precision. They looked for overlap between his movements and past suspicious incidents. They revisited interviews with people who had described odd encounters with him. Bits and pieces that once seemed irrelevant now formed patterns. And the patterns pointed to Ray. Law enforcement kept their approach quiet. They didn't want him running. They wanted certainty. So they watched with careful intention, noting when Ray's truck left the property, how long he stayed in town, who he spoke to, and what seemed to trigger shifts in his behavior. They also noted something else, something subtle, but important. Ray's confidence was thinning. He walked faster, looked over his shoulder more often, hesitated before entering stores, scanned the faces of strangers with suspicion. He seemed physically unchanged, but mentally strained. His voice, once evenly controlled, now wavered at the edges. He spoke less, observed more. His eyes, which once displayed calculated calm, now flickered with unease. One officer described it perfectly. "He looks like a man who's waiting for something to happen." He was. And that waiting consumed him. Ray spent his evenings sitting by the window, staring out into the night. He tried distracting himself with routine, but the quiet only amplified his anxiety. He felt hunted, not because investigators were closing in overtly, but because he sensed the shift in their demeanor. He sensed the air thickening around him. In moments of restless pacing, he questioned whether he had made mistakes, whether he had overlooked something, or trusted someone he shouldn't have, or allowed a detail to slip through the cracks. His mind replayed events in loops, searching for the moment that had triggered the tightening net. He couldn't find it. Ray's world, built on years of predictability, now felt unfamiliar and unsafe. The desert outside no longer looked like an ally but a vast, open field where anything could be watching. He triple-locked doors and still felt exposed. He unplugged appliances as though they could betray him. He avoided answering the phone, convinced each call hid intent. This unraveling didn't go unnoticed. Detectives saw Ray's tension growing, even from a distance. They saw the hurried movements, the scanning eyes, the attempt to remain composed while failing silently. Each observation reinforced their belief, they were closing in on something significant. One detective observed. "He's cracking. He knows it's coming." Ray, alone in his home with nothing but his thoughts and the weight of suspicion, felt cornered even without confrontation. His breathing grew shallow at night. His thoughts raced uncontrollably. Sleep became a battle. Even the smallest sound sent him into alertness. He sensed time slipping. He sensed control fading. He sensed that whatever he had hidden for years was on the verge of being discovered. Meanwhile, law enforcement prepared for the next step, a coordinated move involving multiple departments. They needed legal grounds, but they were getting closer. The concerned witness had offered key details. Officers gathered more statements. Threads began to weave together. Though they didn't yet have the full picture, they had enough to pursue a strategy that would crack the case open. Ray could feel it, not rationally, but instinctively, the way animals sense approaching storms. He felt it in the pacing of his heart, in the prickle at the back of his neck, in the sense of impending collision that grew stronger with every hour. In the final days before the investigation reached critical momentum, Ray appeared visibly altered to the few people who still interacted with him. He was quieter, thinner, less coordinated in conversation. He seemed lost in thought even while speaking, drifting between vigilance and exhaustion. He was a man carrying the weight of secrets too heavy to hold, and for the first time, people around him noticed. One neighbor remarked privately. "He looks like he's expecting something bad to happen." They didn't know how right they were. Ray's carefully maintained image, the thoughtful worker, the quiet recluse, the man who kept to himself, was unraveling thread by thread. And with each thread that fell away, investigators saw more of the truth. Finally, a tipping point arrived. Witness statements aligned with law enforcement hunches. Timeline inconsistencies solidified suspicions. Behavioral analysis matched predicted breakdown patterns. And the buildup of these elements created the momentum the investigation needed. Detectives assembled, ready to take the next, irreversible step. Ray, unaware of the specifics but deeply aware of the pressure, braced himself for an outcome he could no longer avoid. The quiet cat-and-mouse game that had lasted weeks was reaching its final breath. Soon, Ray's world would change forever. And he felt it, like a shadow shifting, like a weight settling, like a final chapter turning itself. The silence before the storm was almost over.